If everyone can please take your seats, we'll get started with the main event. I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Herb Meyer. Herb served during the Reagan administration as Special Assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence and Vice Chairman of the CIA's National Intelligence Council. In these positions, he managed production of U.S. national intelligence estimates and other top-secret projections for the President and his national security advisors. Herb is widely credited with being the first U.S. government official to forecast the collapse of the Soviet Union, a forecast for which he was later awarded the U.S. National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, which is the intelligence community's highest honor. Herb is host and producer of The Siege of Western Civilization, a DVD outlining the threats to our security, our economy, and our culture that became a national bestseller. Formerly an associate editor of Fortune, he has authored several books, including The War Against Progress, Real World Intelligence, and Hard Thinking. Herb and his wife Jill are also co-authors of How to Write, which is among the country's most widely used writing handbooks. Herb's essays on intelligence and politics have been published in the Wall Street Journal, the National Review Online, Policy Review, and the American Thinker. He is author of 2 new ebooks, How to Analyze Information, a step-by-step guide to life's most vital skill, The Cure for Poverty, which explains how the free market works and how entrepreneurs create jobs. Herb has also been a guest on many leading television and radio talk shows. So if you would, please help me welcome our keynote speaker, Herb Meyer.
Thank you, Mickey. Morning. Thank you for inviting me, or I should say inviting me back. While we were having coffee before, somebody came up to me and asked if I'd ever been to the Spy Museum that's opened in Washington. The answer was no. When I worked for President Reagan at the CIA, we didn't have a spy museum. We had spies. It was a very different world, let me tell you. God. Anyway, a lot's happened in the last couple of years, and I want to bring you up to date on that and then spend some time showing you what you can do with this information to help your businesses. So let's turn to business. We've all had the experience of being on an airplane when it hits turbulence, and it's frightening. The plane lurches, loses altitude, one of the overhead bins pops open, and you're just sitting there bouncing along, wondering if maybe you should break the rules, power up your cell phone, make one last call home. And the pilot comes on the intercom. He says, sorry about this. We'll be out of it in 5 or 6 minutes. It's clear up ahead. Well, how does he know that? The answer, of course, is that the pilot has radar in the cockpit. Radar is the instrument that tells him what's out ahead, not what he can see looking out the windshield, what's further out ahead but still invisible. What a lot of people don't realize, even back in Washington, is that the CIA was built to be the president's radar, the instrument that would tell him what the future is going to be, and to tell him that future soon enough and clearly enough so he could prepare for the future, or if he didn't like the future, he could change the future before it happened. That's the point. Did we use spies in covert action? Well, of course we did. And the best use of spies in covert action is to get that information to the president so he can deal with it. In the last decade or so, the CIA has simply turned off the radar. And it's been a series of disasters. 9/11 itself, that mess over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Just a few days before we were here 2 years ago, there was that disaster at the Benghazi consulate. It's been 2 years. We still don't know what happened in Benghazi. General Petraeus did a superb job for us in Iraq, but then he took over the CIA, and it was a mess. He was the wrong man. It was a classic case of putting a good man in the wrong job. And then, as you may recall, his personal life became kind of complicated. First rule of Washington, never sleep with your biographer. I've told my official biographer, under no circumstances will I sleep with him. Paul, his wife Susan, and their 8 children said they were greatly relieved to hear this was not going to be an issue. Well, I was lucky enough to be part of President Reagan's radar, and this morning I want to do for you what we did last time. I want to paint a picture of the world that lies in front of us at the other side of this turbulence we're going through, and there's some extraordinary business opportunities emerging that you may not be aware of yet. I want to show you what those are, and I want to show you some specific steps you can take to prepare your business for them. But just in the last year or so, the turbulence we're going through has gotten a lot worse, a lot more frightening. So I want to do for a few minutes what we didn't do last time. I want to talk about this turbulence that we're going through right now. I want to give you a sense of what it is and why it's happening and where it's likely to go. Look, the first rule of events like this is we don't get political. And I don't mean to be political. This is not a place to be partisan, but this is a time to be grown up. So please bear with me while I explain this. I'm not trying to be political. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but we've got to understand this for our own safety and security. The best way to understand what's happening with ISIS and the Khorasan group and all that is actually to look back into history. We'll go to 1945. World War II had just ended. It was a terrible war. All we wanted to do was bring home our troops. We're Americans. When the war's over, we want to bring home the troops. But we didn't. The people who led our country understood something. The war isn't over just because the bullets stopped flying. It takes a long, long time to get things stable. And in fact, when World War I had ended, we left Europe. We walked away and kaboom, right into World War II. The president in 1945 was, of course, Harry Truman, and he had been a soldier in World War I. He remembered what happened. The men who led our country, Truman, George Marshall, the great Army general who then became Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who succeeded him as Secretary of State, and the Republican leaders in Congress didn't want to make the same mistake. They thought maybe we should stick around for a while, get everything under control. At the same time, there were new leaders emerging in Europe who had survived the war, but were not Nazis, were not fascists, and the same in Japan. It was a newer generation. People like Konrad Adenauer in Germany, even Charles de Gaulle in France, and so forth. And what they said to Truman and the other people is, look, thanks for what you did, America, but to tell you the truth, we don't like you that much. You're a bunch of sweaty, hairy-chested, Bible-thumping morons. We're much more sophisticated than you are. Our music, our literature, our wine, our art. Except every time we play in a sandbox, we start a world war. So would you please stick around and make sure we don't do that again? So on both sides of the Atlantic and across the Pacific to Japan, people were saying, you know, let's just stick around for a while. We're still there. It's been 75 years. The cost of keeping 100,000 troops in Europe and in Japan, it's incalculable. You're talking billions of trillions of dollars, if you can even come up with a number. It's been one of the greatest successes in world history. Europe and Japan have been the most peaceful, prosperous parts of the world ever. And it's thanks in large part to that brilliant and very gutsy decision by the people who led us, Democrats and Republicans alike. Stick around. Don't go home. And boy, did that succeed. It's something we should teach our children to be very, very proud of. We didn't want to do this. It cost us a fortune. But boy, it kept the peace, kept stability, world's never seen an era of peace and prosperity like this in history. Well, now fast forward to 2008. We had won the war in Iraq. Whether you think going into Iraq was a good idea or a bad idea, that's another conversation over a couple of beers at some point. I'm one of the 310 million Americans Bush didn't ask either. So I'm not defending anything. I wish he'd asked. In the real world, there's no rewind button. What happened, happened. We went in. We made some terrible mistakes once we went in. But to his credit, George W. Bush figured out that we were going the wrong way. He changed his strategy. He changed his generals. There was the surge, and we won the war. And the definition of win was Iraq was stable. It was at peace. It was intact. They were holding elections and trying to get things organized. This was an extraordinary achievement, but nobody wanted to say this out loud. The politics here had become so poisonous that you just couldn't even talk about it. We won the war. God bless our troops. They won the war. And then we walked away. We just took them out of there with no troops left. We did in 2009, 10, 11, what we didn't do in 1945, 46, 47 in Europe. You know, if we had pulled the troops out of Germany in 1945, who knows what would have happened? Russians might have moved in. Could have had a bunch of lunatic Nazis retake Munich. I mean, anything could have happened. Who knows? But of course, none of that happened. Couldn't. Not with 100,000 troops standing there. Well, we walked away from Iraq. Now, again, whether you think going into Iraq or not was a good or a bad idea, it's another conversation. And again, there's no rewind button in the real world. Having won the war, we simply walked away. It was obvious to everyone what would happen, which is the bad guys would come back. There was a power vacuum. The Iraqis wouldn't be able to hold it together without us. Neither could the Germans in 1945. Neither could the new Japanese government in 1946. So yeah, everybody moved back in. All the bad guys moved back in. ISIS, or ISIL as the White House likes to call it, it's Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. They just changed the name. Okay? Now they're talking about this Khorasan group, which sounds to me like a Chicago consulting company. I mean, nobody'd ever heard of these guys before last Tuesday. This is just playing games with words. It's just the bad guys coming back, okay? They're just using different calling cards. It's the same thing. So that's what we're up against. We made a mistake. We pulled out. We shouldn't have. That's what happened. Now we're obviously having to go back in. Whether we're doing this rightly or wrongly, again, honorable people can disagree. If you talk to any military person, he'll tell you the same thing. This time, do it right. Send in the 82nd Airborne, send in the Marines, send in SEAL Team 6. Say, just go get them and don't worry about collateral damage. And this thing will be over in 90 days. If we don't want to do it that way, it'll take longer. There'll be more trouble. So that's what we're up against. That's what you're seeing. It's just a classic case of we made a mistake and the guys in charge don't quite want to say, I made a mistake. This is interesting because we do this in business all the time. And you know, to his credit, and again, I'm not a big George W. Bush fan, he recognized he'd made a mistake and then changed his strategy, changed his generals, launched the surge, and we won. Let's see if this president recognizes that he's making a mistake and changes it. We'll see. No one's got a crystal ball. Here's something you should do. As citizens, we can all have our opinion. We can argue about this at the dinner table and things like that. But you're running businesses, and you need to take steps. If I were you, I'd put a little cash aside. Let me show you what I mean. I'll bet every one of you here this morning has more cash in your wallet or in your pocketbook than you need to get back to the office this afternoon and home this evening. You probably don't need any cash. You'll pay your parking bill with a credit card. But you know, sometimes a little cash comes in handy, so we all have cash. A lot of us have a few $20 bills in the top drawer of our dresser in the bedroom. If your teenager's going out in the evening, you sort of want to make sure they have 20 bucks on that pocket. Sometimes there's no substitute for cash. We're in a period now where something goofy could happen. There could be a terrorist attack. I don't think Chicago is going to become a pile of radioactive rubble, but there could be some kind of attack, whether it's something like the Boston Marathon or some lone crazy lunatic who beheads someone in Oklahoma, or somebody goes and hits the Mall of America. At the moment, ISIS and the Al-Qaeda people, everyone's competing to see who can hit us at the moment, which is why it's dangerous. So something could happen, and it wouldn't be surprising if the geniuses in Washington overreact. The airlines could shut down for a while. Look, there was a fire at the control tower at O'Hare last Friday. One lunatic just about took down the whole air transportation system. And I was one of the people caught in it, too. Something could happen. Again, it doesn't have to be a massive terrorist attack, but everyone's on a knife's edge in Washington. They could shut it down. They could shut down the air system. They could shut down the banks. Everything could just shut for a few days. Might be an overreaction, but that could happen. Well, you don't need to get paid Thursday, but I'll bet there are some people working for you who do need to get paid Thursday. That's grocery money for them. You may have some trucks or cars on the road and you need to get gas in them. Well, the ATM machines aren't working, the credit card thing stopped at the gas station, the guys at the gas station are holding up a big sign saying cash only. There may be somebody here visiting from your Los Angeles office. All this happens, he needs to get back home because his wife just went into the hospital to give birth to their first child. Only way you're going to get him the cash, the money to get home is cash. Sit in your office for a moment and say, how much cash do I need to keep things going for a few days? Now look, you can't keep things going for a month, you can't keep them going for 3 months. That's beyond the capacity of most people like you. But you know, just for a few days, could you have a little cash handy? And when I say cash, I mean money. I don't mean we have a checking account and there's cash in it, because if the bank shut down, you can't get to it. Again, you're probably okay for a week or so, but you may have people working for you who aren't. There may be some oddity in your business where you need a little cash for some reason. Give this a moment's thought. Have a little cash handy. I was mentioning this to a group in another city last month. And after the group broke up and I was heading for the elevator, one of the people in the audience came up to me. Turned out he was the CEO of a rather well-known company. You'd recognize the name if I told you. And he said, I'm already doing that. I said, you are? He said, yeah. He said, I've put aside enough cash and food to feed my staff for 90 days. Well, I thought that was extreme. That was extraordinary. I don't think I'll ever hear that again from someone. And I'm not suggesting you put food aside. But, you know, could you put aside a little cash for 3 or 4 days? It's not a bad idea. We'll get through this. ISIS isn't going to destroy the United States. Al-Qaeda isn't. Whether this president gets a grip on it or whether he leaves it behind and his successor does, don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But it's going to be a little sticky. It's going to be unpleasant. But we will get through this. This is turbulence. And what I want to do now is what we were doing last time, which is to look past the turbulence, because the business opportunities that are emerging are extraordinary. And when you look at the radar that lets you see further out ahead, the first thing you see is that the world is becoming modern. And this is what the war is really all about. It's about modernity. And the best way to explain modernity is, once again, we go back into history. Go to Europe at the end of the 17th century, 1690, 1695, sometime around there. Life was terrible. Lifespan was very short, mid-40s in most places. Most people were half-starved most of the time. When they prayed that when the next famine came, at least some of their children might survive. That's what you prayed for. That's how bad it was. People were illiterate, uneducated. Women weren't allowed to be educated. Travel was uncommon. Most people spent their entire lives within 20 miles of where they'd been born. You had no say in how you were governed. You're a peasant, you're a serf, you shut up and did what you were told. And nothing changed. Tomorrow is the same as yesterday. The way you plowed the field, that's how your grandfather did it. That's how your grandson would do it. If you were the woman of the house, the way you prepared meals, washed clothes, that's how your grandmother did it. That's how your granddaughter would do it. Life was static. The modern world is very different. Lifespan's nearly 80. Incomes vary widely, bothers some people. No one's starving. For the first time in history, we have a society, the modern world, no one's starving. Do you realize what an extraordinary human achievement that is? And it's happened within our lifetimes. There is simply no one starving in the modern world. It's so incredible that today we are told accurately the biggest health problem faced by poor people is obesity. Isn't that amazing? Women are educated, they're literate, they own businesses, they run for political office, we travel all the time. We have a huge say in how we're governed. We don't always like the outcome of elections, but we have a big say in it. And nothing stays the same. The technical word for the kind of change we live with is industrial productivity. From the moment someone comes along and says, you know, there's a better way to do this, person starts a business, they hire people, standards of living go up, then there's a whole industry doing it. Then there's a second industry and a third, on. And 5, 10, 30 years later, someone comes along with an even better way to do it that completely changes the first industry. Then it happens to the second industry and the third and on and on. It's like an escalator that never actually stops. Like with any piece of machinery, from time to time, that escalator breaks down. And if it breaks down and you don't have a good firm grip on it, you can get hurt. Then the escalator picks up again and it goes. That's us. That's the modern world. That's who we are. That's how we live. Our transition to the modern world wasn't smooth and seamless. The 18th and 19th centuries were violent. In our own country, we broke apart into a civil war, right? 1861. We simply fractured into two countries. The Civil War went on for over 4 years. We killed more than 700,000 of each other, which, by the way, it's about 3 times the number of people who've been killed in Iraq and Syria combined. Look what a mess we made of it. Before it ended, a president had been assassinated. And yet we came through that. And other countries did too. The 20th century was ghastly. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Bosnia, fascism, communism. Look what it took to get us here. And when you look at the war, when you look at all the turmoil in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Afghanistan, what you're looking at now is the entire Islamic world beginning to make the journey we began more than 300 years ago. That's what this is about. And what we keep saying to these people is, can't you guys do this by next Thursday? No, look what it took us. Look at all the mistakes we made along the way. And you've got to understand, this is not just political, it's very human. If you've been to the Mideast or you've seen this on movies or television, these Arab gentlemen sitting at cafes with these tiny cups of sweet coffee that they drink. Look, life's not great. They didn't drive up in BMWs and Lexuses. They don't have homes like yours or mine. They sit at the cafe half the night, they're smoking, they're drinking. When the cafe closes, they go to their homes. No one talks back to them. No one. My wife and daughter talk back to me. Not in their homes. And what we're saying to this gentleman is, look, come into the modern world. It's terrific. You can have a job, you know, a car, your wife's going to get a washer and a dryer, your kid's going to get an education. And he's looking right back at us and saying, oh, my wife has, what do you call this thing, charge card? And I turn to my 14-year-old daughter and I say, where do you think you're going dressed like that? And she won't even take these headphones off to talk to me? You want me to live like that? It's not how my father lived. It's not how my grandfather lived. Look, there's a point in there, okay? He's got his dignity. Doesn't have much, but he's got his dignity. He's got his honor. And we're asking him to leap into the 21st century on the theory that, it's going to be okay. That's an enormous human leap. It's not political. And the appeal of the radicals, whether you call them Al-Qaeda, whether you call it the Khorasan group, whether you call it ISIS or ISIL, it's all the same thing. The appeal is you don't have to put up with that. Don't fall for that. Don't let them take away your honor, your dignity, and your control. And when you have very little, that's appealing to some people. That's a very human thing. Now, in the long run, modernity wins. In the short run, you can kill a lot of people. But don't lose sight of the fact that we always talk politically. It's very human. We're asking these people to go from, in effect, the 7th century to the 21st century overnight. Look at the mess we made of it, and we expect them to do it smoothly. Be a little more patient. Be a little more understanding. And by the way, there are a lot of things that are actually going well, but they don't make the news. Airplane lands on time isn't a Fox News alert. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, they completed presidential elections in Afghanistan. This is one of the most extraordinary events of our lifetime. They held the first round of elections a few months ago, and the candidates held a series of televised presidential debates, just like we do. Young people were attending rallies, tweeting, they were out campaigning, putting up posters, knocking on doorbells, all the things you do in a country like ours. They held the first round of voting. They eliminated some candidates. They held the second round. They were down to 2 candidates. And they held the third round of voting to choose the final president. Things got a little sloppy. There were accusations of voter fraud and miscounting votes and things like that, and it got a little dicey. Well, the 2 candidates reached an agreement about 3 or 4 days ago. They would govern together. One of them would be president. The other would be, it's a new position, it's basically chief executive, in effect like prime minister. By the way, the guy who is the new president, among other interesting items in his background, has taught at Johns Hopkins University, worked for the IMF, and actually been an American citizen. And the number 2 guy's got a background that's equally impressive. And they met with each other, and they actually worked out a compromise, and yesterday they were sworn into office. Wow. Now look, it's politics, it's Afghanistan. Something can go wrong tonight or next Thursday, I understand that. But holy cow, this is one of the most extraordinary events of our lifetimes. These elections in Afghanistan were better managed and the votes more accurately counted than anything we will see for another 50 years in Chicago. A friend of mine in Chicago says I'm an optimist. It's going to be 100 years. But you know, this is extraordinary, and it barely made the newspapers. And yet, look, the Afghans, everyone's looking at Iraq, and the Afghans have completed the most extraordinary modern election cycle imaginable. Wow, good for them. And by the way, good for the armed forces of the United States, because those guys made it possible. When something goes right, you just don't hear about it. Every morning, millions of couples are getting up in the Islamic world, giving their kids breakfast, getting them off to school, and saying things like, you know, I'd really rather have a Starbucks on the corner than a car bomb. And why can't we get IKEA in here or Walmart instead of some lunatic mosque? That doesn't make the headlines. Your average 15-year-old in Tahrir Square, Cairo, knows more about the iPhone 6 than I know. Mine arrived yesterday. I've got it. He hasn't got it. He can probably tell me more of the features of it. And he says, why isn't there an Apple store here? Why can't I get one? Well, get this thing under control. Apple's going to be there. So's Banana Republic, Urban Outfitters, Subway sandwiches, and everybody else. The world is becoming modern at a rate the newspapers don't report to you. Understandably, they tell us about the problems, and they're serious problems. But don't not be aware that there are also things going right. And we will live in a modern world. If we don't, your children will. We're living through one of the greatest moments in history. We've waited 21 centuries for the Islamic world to begin doing what Judaism and Christianity did centuries ago, which is to become modern. They're on the road. Is it sloppy? Yes. Do we often go backwards rather than forwards? Of course. So did we. But it's begun. And that's a great moment in history. And as the world becomes modern, Now we can see the second very big thing happening as that radar screen sweeps around. Not only is the world becoming modern, the world's becoming rich, fast. And here are the numbers. It's become a lot richer in the last 2 years. By 1980 or 1990, about 2 billion human beings had emerged from poverty. Since then, another 500 million or so have emerged from poverty, a lot of them in China and India. In the last couple of years, about 6 million Brazilians have come out of poverty. About 20 million Brazilians actually have come out of poverty. Today, on the continent of Africa, the number of people with disposable income is over 300 million. It's bigger than the US population. Did you know that 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are in sub-Saharan Africa? Did you know that Pizza Hut and Kentucky Fried Chicken recently announced that the busiest franchises they operate are in Lagos, Nigeria? It's not Denver, it's not Los Angeles, it's not New York, it's Lagos, Nigeria. When you put all the numbers together, what you've got is this. Each year, between 50 million and 100 million human beings are now crossing the line out of poverty. The low credible estimate is 50 million a year. The high credible estimate is 100 million a year. With numbers that big, you can't be too precise. I think it's been a lot closer to the higher estimate over the last several years, but let's be conservative. With the global recession, let's drop the numbers down. Every year, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70 million human beings are crossing the line out of poverty. When we say someone's out of poverty, we don't mean they have a big house with a swimming pool in the backyard and 2 SUVs in the driveway. To be out of poverty means there's enough food to eat. You're living decently, not as nicely as you live or I live, but living decently. The children have been inoculated against the basic childhood illnesses, as your children have, as mine were. They're getting up in the morning, they're off to school. At least one of the parents has some kind of work that gives them some disposable income, not as much as you've got or I've got, but some disposable income. That's what it actually means to be out of poverty. And today, more human beings are reaching that point than at any time in history. And since the last time we were together, the number of people emerging from poverty has accelerated. What it means is this. If this trend continues, and at the moment it's accelerating, but if it's simply stabilized and continued, it means that within your lifetimes, within the lifetimes of probably half of you sitting here today, certainly within our children's lifetimes, the world will cross a line that's never been crossed before and most people never even dreamed could be approached. For the first time in history, the overwhelming majority of human beings will not be poor. Isn't that stunning? And there isn't a single student at a high school or university in Colorado or where I live who is being told this is happening. They will grow up in a world in which, for the first time in history, the overwhelming majority of human beings are not poor. Wow. Why is it happening? Because we figured it out. There are some things you need a genius to figure out. Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine. One day, another genius will develop a pill that prevents dementia, cures cancer. Other things you don't need a genius to figure out. And a good example is physical fitness. You want to be physically fit, eat sensibly, get a lot of exercise. Everybody knows that. Well, everybody knows that more people do it. That's why you see people jogging all hours of the day and night. People like us join health clubs. We talk about eating sensibly, or we eat sensibly. I've never done it, but as an intellectual concept, it's appealing. On a larger scale, if you want to bring your population out of poverty, it's the free market. Property rights, the rule of law, stable financial system, reasonable regulation. It's obvious. Everybody knows it. Sorry. It's obvious to everyone who didn't go to Harvard Law School. Every peasant, where I come from, there's an old saying, you can always tell a Harvard man. However, you cannot tell him very much. Turns out to be true. Every peasant in every field in the world understands what I just said. They can't put those labels on it. What they know is that the government will protect them rather than threaten them. Give them a framework, property rights, rule of law, stable financial system, reasonable regulation and taxation. Do things a government's supposed to do, protect them from foreign invasion. build roads, run the schools, deliver the mail, pick up the garbage, and on and on and on. And then just get out of the way. People come along, they start businesses, they hire other people, standards of living go up. Everybody knows that. Well, everybody knows that more governments do it. Today, all over the world, governments are putting in place these free market mechanisms. That's what's happening. And the result is the biggest underreported news story in the world: the emergence of a global middle class. This is absolutely stunning. You see this all the time, all over the place. You go to some country you've never heard of before on a business trip or a family vacation. You get up to your hotel room, you push back the curtains to look out. There's traffic going back and forth. You look down to the left, there's a shopping complex. You look the other way, there's a movie theater and a couple of restaurants. You go, when did that happen? Last 30 years. You order something by telephone, and you know how often the call gets bounced to India, the Philippines? Well, now it's picked up by somebody in a call center in Nairobi. There's a call center there called KenCall, Kenya Call Center. Sitting in a call center in Nairobi, you're in an office building, set of headphones on, computer on the table, finish your work shift, you jump in the car, pick up your kid at the daycare center, swing over to the supermarket, get something for supper. There's a chain of supermarkets in Africa called Massmart. Walmart's bought them now. There's another chain called Nakumatt. They put up big box grocery stores like Costco all over Africa. Go home, flip on the 42-inch flat screen TV while you catch up on the local news, while you get supper on the table. After supper, walk the dog, run your kids over to some high school soccer practice or a PTA meeting or church choir practice, or just watch a movie on television before you go to sleep. All over the world, in countries most people have never heard of, couldn't find on a map, we now have these middle-class societies. And as I say, it's the biggest underreported news story in the world. Now, it's good for several reasons. First is the human one. It's just a lot of children not hungry. It's just an absolutely wonderful thing. The second reason is very political. People like us don't go to war with people like us. Just don't. You send nasty emails. That doesn't work, you call the lawyers. You don't go in shooting. It's almost impossible to get people in a successful democracy to want war. They're too busy with their jobs, with their kids. People would rather shop than fight. And I'll give you an example of this. Western Europe. World War I and World War II started in Western Europe, so did half the wars of the 19th century. Today, Western Europe is in worse financial trouble than at any time in its history. It's a disaster. I'll give you an example of this. After I left here a couple of years ago, my wife and I did something we'd never done before. We rented an apartment in Rome for a month. It was the neatest thing we ever did. It was a wonderful vacation. We know the city well, but renting an apartment and living there is just not the same thing as staying in a hotel. It's fantastic. Anyway, one of the things we learned is that 50% of young Italians, young meaning under the age of 35, have never held a job. They've never worked. That's the official figure. Wander through Rome, it's obviously higher than that. The official figure they just put out a couple of weeks ago is that 64% of young Romans, young meaning under 35, 64% are still living at home. And if you're living at home, you're not working, you're not starting a family, you're not getting married. This is, by the way, not just an economic catastrophe, it's a human catastrophe. And you can actually see it playing out. IKEA opened a store in the city of Pisa, Italy. It took them 8 years to get approval to open the store. This being IKEA, we can assume they did the paperwork correctly, okay? Took them 8 years. When they were ready to open the store, they advertised for 200 jobs. They got 29,000 applications. And after that, they opened a store in Sicily. They got 43,700 applications. That's how bad this is. And Spain's in worse shape than Italy. Greece is in worse shape than Spain. Portugal's not doing so great. Boy, are they in trouble. Well, there isn't going to be a war. Not a chance. Germany isn't arming secretly behind the Rhine. Italy's not about to invade Ethiopia. Spain's not going to hit Portugal. The finance ministers are going to meet next week. They'll come up with another crazy euro loan. They'll push things down the road. Look, as I told you last time, I'm the biggest hawk you're ever going to meet. I was Reagan's guy at the CIA. I have actually fondled nuclear bombs, okay? Very smooth, by the way, more than you would think. Never give up your armed forces. There's always some idiot out there who wants to cause trouble, whether it's an Adolf Hitler, Osama bin Laden, maybe a Vladimir Putin. But the kind of wars we've seen in the past are much less likely in the future as the world becomes modern, as it becomes out of poverty and creates a global middle class, because it's almost impossible to get middle-class people to want war. That's a good thing. Your children, your grandchildren will live in a safer world. Once we get through this turmoil that we're going through, the world's going to be much quieter and safer. It's becoming very middle class very quickly. That's fantastic. And there's a third reason this is so important. It's the one most directly related to you. As we become modern, as the world comes out of poverty, as we create a global middle class, it means the total customer base for every product and service you provide is now growing at a rate of 50 to 100 million new customers every year. Wow. That's the best news you'll ever hear. Now, these customers may not be where you would like them to be. You may have to alter the products and services you're selling to reach them, and we're going to get into that in some detail this morning. But anytime somebody tells you that the total customer base for what you're selling is growing at a rate of 50 to 100 million new customers every year, that's quite extraordinary. That's a world we've never lived in before. Boy, do we need these customers. And the reason we need them so badly, and the reason we need them so badly right now, is because of the third and last of the very big things that are happening in the world as that radar screen sweeps around. This one's happening in our part of the world. It's not a very good trend, and no one saw this coming. The first big thing is the world's becoming modern. Second big thing, coming out of poverty and creating a global middle class. And the third big thing is we're getting old. And here are the numbers. If you want to sustain a country's population, the birth rate has to be 2.1. 2.1 births per woman. You need 2 births just to replace the mother and father. Then you need 0.1. Some children don't live, don't grow up and have their own children. So the key number to sustain a population is 2.1. Today in Western Europe, the birth rate is 1.5, 30% below replacement. What that means is 30 years from now, there will be between 70 and 80 million fewer Europeans alive than are alive today. It's the biggest, fastest population drop that's ever happened in world history. The birth rate in Germany is 1.3. Ask a German teenager, how many cousins have you got? And the kid says, what's a cousin? If you have one child and the child grows up and marries someone who's also an only child, and then they have one child, which is what's happening, no aunt, there's no uncle, there's no cousin. In Germany, 30% of all women are childless. Among college-educated German women, 40% are childless. That's shutdown. It means the number of deaths among Germans vastly exceeds the number of births. The population of living Germans is plunging. And by the way, if here in Denver, Colorado, 40% of college-educated women were childless, it's a different place. It's not the same thing. The 2 countries in Western Europe with the lowest birth rate are Italy and Spain, 1.2 dropping to 1.1. With a 1.2 birth rate in 20 years, you lose 30% of your entire working age population. Can you imagine if here in Denver you lost 30% of the entire working age population in the next 20 years? That's what's happening in Rome. That's what's happening in Madrid right now. It means you're dead. Who's in the schools? Who's in the malls? Who's in the restaurants? Who's buying the products and services you're selling? This is what's happening. turns out, also to everyone's surprise, there's a powerful correlation between faith and children. People of faith tend to lead traditional lives. Grow up, get married, settle down, have a family. Europe has lost its faith. Europe describes itself as a secular post-Judeo-Christian civilization. It's that phrase for it in their new constitution. It's an elegant way of saying the churches are empty except for a few old ladies and American tourists. Absolutely true. If your whole population thinks, look, this is a cosmic joke, okay? We're a collection of molecules held together by gravity. Some point we activate, some point we deactivate. That's what you think. You're not going to fight for anything. What are you fighting for? This is a joke. You're here for the ride. It's a lot more pleasant to sit at a cafe, go skiing, or go for a bike ride than it is to stay up all night with a sick kid. So they stopped having children. They also stopped getting married. Today in Europe, only 1 out of 7 couples gets married. Marriage is over. Last year, the total number of marriages in England was lower than the total number of marriages in England in 1895. They don't like having babies. They don't like getting married. Turns out they don't like working either. The average, don't laugh, you're being culturally insensitive, which in Denver may be a criminal thing at this point. The average European gets an additional 450 hours per year vacation versus an American. That's 10 and a half weeks. Give every one of your employees an additional 10 and a half weeks of paid vacation, you've got a real problem. The gap with Scandinavia is bigger, it's about 17 weeks. Statistically, 1 out of 5 working-age Swedes is on permanent disability insurance. It's just odd, they look healthy to me. Here's what actually happens as your birth rates drop, and I may have mentioned this to you last time. I was talking to a woman in California. She has 1 sister. So her parents produced 2 children to take care of 2 parents. In other words, work, generate the tax revenue for Medicare, Social Security, all the programs for older people, the buses that run them around to shopping centers, movie matinees, things like that. And take care of your parents, literally stay in touch, get together on holidays, things to do with parents. This young woman has a partner, not a husband, a partner. They don't plan to have children. The sister's married, has got 1 kid, they don't plan to have any more. So these 4 people produced 1 child. Do you realize the tax burden on that 1 child to support 4 people? That's crushing. Whatever health care plans we wind up with, the cost won't drop. Those 4 are going to live longer. That doesn't even include the human element of stay in touch with your parents, get together on holidays, things you do with parents. When you go from 2 or 3 or 4 children to take care of 2 parents to 1 to take care of 4, you just killed your economy. It's math, it's not politics. That's what the Europeans have done. They completely killed the economy. They are literally beginning to die. And what you're looking at in Europe isn't an overvalued euro or recession, it's a demographic death spiral. The same thing is happening in Japan. It's gotten worse since the last time we were here. The birth rate in Japan is 1.3 and steadily dropping. That means 30 years from now, there will be between 50 and 60 million fewer Japanese alive than are alive today. Now, if you know Japan, they're not bringing in 50 million Koreans to help run it or 50 million Turks the way they do in Europe. They're shutting it down. They've already closed 2,000 schools in Japan, K through 12, and they're now closing schools at a rate of 400 school closings every year. When we were here 2 years ago, they were closing 300 schools a year. Now they're closing 400 schools a year. They're shutting down universities, and they're beginning to combine prefectures, which is their states. That would be like combining Indiana and Illinois because you just can't make it on your own anymore. That's shut down. What actually happens is this. When your birth rate drops below the 2.1 replacement level, your entire population is aging because you don't have enough young people replacing older people. Japan is aging so fast, by 2020, just 6 years from now, 1 out of every 5 Japanese citizens will be over the age of 70. And no one can figure out how to run a modern society with 1 out of 5 people over 70. You can't do it. And it's getting worse. Since we were here last, Japan's had terrible troubles. That earthquake, that typhoon, tidal wave, and the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. You probably saw stories that there was no looting in Japan. Of course not. Old people don't loot. Last year, Unicharm, which is the largest manufacturer of diapers in Japan, announced that for the first time, they are now selling more adult diapers than baby diapers. Isn't that stunning? You realize that's national suicide. Sayonara. Japan is simply committing national suicide, and they know it. It's the world's 2nd or 3rd largest economy. Here's what's happening in the United States. It's shifting around a little bit. For 30 years, the U.S. birth rate was stuck at 2, just below the 2.1 replacement level. So we were going in the same direction as everyone else, but not at the same rate. It was a more shallow glide path down. 3 years ago, for the first time in 30 years, the U.S. birth rate hit the 2.1 replacement level. So everyone figured, well, great, we're starting to turn this around, it's getting better. When demographers looked closely at the numbers, what they found was this. 3 years ago, the Anglo birth rate in the U.S. was 1.8, below the replacement level. 3 years ago, the Hispanic birth rate in the U.S. was 3.2. That's why we hit the 2.1. Now, with the recession that we've had, with a lot of Hispanics returning to their native countries, particularly in places like Colorado, once again, the U.S. birth rate has dropped. It's at 1.9. So we're below the replacement level again. Remember I said there's a correlation between faith and children? Anybody want to guess the state with the lowest birth rate, the state with the highest birth rate? Yeah, the one with the lowest birth rate is Vermont, secular liberal Vermont. If the present trend continues, the last 2 surviving Vermonters are Ben and Jerry. And the highest is Utah. Here's what's happening globally. By the way, every statistic I'm giving you is an official statistic. These are World Health Organization numbers, which is United Nations, their government numbers. There is absolutely no dispute among demographers about these numbers. You can argue over what they mean, whether they're good or bad, but there's no dispute about the numbers. They're rock solid. You just count. What makes it so frustrating is if we get up from here, spend the rest of the week driving around to high schools, universities, how many instructors do you think will find teaching that all through the West, birth rates are imploding? Not many. What they teach here in Denver, where I live, Europe, Japan, the worst thing that ever happened to planet Earth is humanity. We pollute, we use resources. Teach that to kids, and a lot of them grow up. They think bringing a baby into the world is committing a hostile act against the planet. And we act surprised when the birth rate plunges. Again, that's ideology infecting education. I'll give you a good example of that. If you have kids in high school, take a look at the history book they're using. The most widely used history book in American high schools is called People's History of the United States. The author is Howard Zinn. Z-I-N-N. He died a couple of years ago, but his book is still being used. He was a member of the Communist Party USA. I don't mean he was sort of a commie, say when somebody argues with you about the tax rate, you call him a left-wing pinko commie. He was hardcore. If you're Communist Party USA, I mean, these guys are hardcore. There aren't many left. He is the author of the most widely used history textbook that every kid out there is using at school. And you wonder why they're coming away with an attitude toward our country that is unlike anything we've heard before. It's a disaster. Anyway, our birth rate has dropped below the replacement level. Canada is at 1.5, right in the middle of the European average. Mexico's birth rate is changing now. It was way over 3, and now it's down to about 2.6 or 2.7, which is pretty healthy. Despite the problems they're having in Mexico with crime and with drugs, Mexico is developing a huge middle class very quickly. And as it does, the birth rate is now coming down to a better level. This is good. There are some Latin American countries where the birth rate is just skimming above the 2.1 replacement level, and that's good. That's good for business because it means the population is growing. Countries like Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. So there's some good news there. It's just slightly above the replacement level, but mostly through the West and all the major countries, birth rates are below the replacement level, and there's one exception. There's only one country in the entire modern world whose birth rate is substantially above the 2.1 replacement level, and that's Israel. The birth rate is 3. 30 years from now, there will be more young people in Israel than in Germany. Isn't that stunning? Imagine going to Hitler in 1944. Say, hey, Adolf, don't blow your brains out. I mean, stick around. It's like really interesting. One of your Wehrmacht soldiers is going to become Pope. That's Benedict. Oh, yeah, there'd be a country you never heard of called Israel with an army that could wipe out the Wehrmacht. It's actually happening. Isn't that extraordinary? In the Islamic world, birth rates are much higher. They go from 2.4 to 6.8. Even these are coming down, and in just the last year, there's been new research that caught all the demographers very much by surprise. In some of the Islamic countries, birth rates are plunging. This has never happened before. And the 2 Islamic countries where birth rates are plunging the fastest are Turkey and Iran. The birth rate in Iran has dropped so far, so fast, that today, the birth rate in the capital of Tehran is lower than the birth rate in Manhattan, New York. That's stunning. What it means is that for all practical purposes, Iran doesn't have a next generation. I mean, they do literally, but not enough to sustain that country, and they're perfectly aware of it. Which, by the way, makes it more dangerous because they're running up against a suicide problem, a national suicide problem. When you put all these numbers together, here's what you've got. World population is continuing to increase, but it's decelerating quickly now. Over the next 30 years or so, world population will top out somewhere between 9 and 10 billion and then begin to go down. Those are the official numbers. There's virtually no dispute about those numbers. It's just there's a complete disconnect between the numbers and what everyone's being told. Now, there's something going on inside these numbers that gets almost no attention, but in my judgment lies at the core of our economic problems today and the future of your businesses. And it's this: we're living longer and having fewer children. So populations are aging. Now, they're aging in different rates at different places. In Japan, it's catastrophic. By 2020, 1 out of 5 citizens is over the age of 70. Here in the United States, as the baby boomers hit their 60s in huge waves, what demographers call the elderly dependency ratio, the percentage of the population that's old, will double in the next 20 years, from 18 and 19% to 38, 39%. So if you're racing through an airport terminal or wandering through a shopping mall and you think, gee, there are a lot of old geezers around, it's not your imagination. Flying in from Seattle yesterday, you know, I've been flying for a long time. Used to be when the ticket agent opened the door, said, who needs a little extra time getting down the jetway? 4, 5, 6 people. Coming in yesterday, by the time they finished pre-boarding, there are about 6 of us left. You know, we're all billion-mile Alaska Airlines flyers. I mean, it's not your imagination. Population's getting old. In Europe, by 2050, 49% of the entire population will be old. Greece, 59%. The real shocker is Germany, the locomotive of Europe. Everyone thinks the economic engine that will pull Europe out of its recession. By 2040, 61% of Germans will be old. That's not a country, that's a nursing home. Okay? According to the United Nations, and I keep emphasizing these are official numbers, there's no dispute about the numbers, by about 2045, for the first time in history, the number of humans over the age of 55 will be larger than the number of humans under the age of 15. That's a pyramid upside down on its point. It doesn't mean that in 2045 the pyramid flips. What it means is this: every year from now on, through the rest of your careers, the rest of your lives, there will be more and more and more older people until by about 2045, for the first time in history, there are actually more older people than younger people. That's never happened before. And why is that so crucial for you in business? Because old people don't spend money the way young people spend money. That's why. When our country was coming out of its last big recession, that was 80-82, the first Reagan administration. If you're old enough to remember, that was a terrible recession. Unemployment was over 11%. That was a real mess. Well, people like me and Mickey and a few others, we were starting businesses, we were starting families. Boy, did we spend money. Get to be my age. You know, you put it aside for retirement, health care, your next root canal. My doctor would like me to have a colonoscopy every 3 weeks. You should see his new boat, by the way, just docked it in the harbor. It's really nice. But you know, you also think differently. Things that used to matter don't matter. When Jill and I were coming back from that month in Rome, on the flight home, I said, by the way, what'd you buy? Now you wind up in the fancy shops on the Via Condotti at some point. I said, what'd you buy? And she laughed. She said, you know, absolutely nothing. I just didn't feel like buying anything. She said, did you get anything? I said, no. If I need something, I run into Nordstrom. They always have what I want. It's easy. It takes a minute. You know, I just don't make a big fuss about this stuff. Another example, when I was working for President Reagan, we had a little house in Georgetown. We had some dinner parties at the house where the security people sealed off the street because of who was coming. It seemed important to us that everything was just right. So we had some friends over for dinner a couple of weeks ago, and after they left, Jill and I were cleaning up, and we managed to break 2 of the wine glasses. So we were cleaning it up, and Jill said, oh, just stop at the thrift store and see what they've got. You know, at this point in my career, if all 6 wine glasses don't match, it isn't going to make a difference. I don't care anymore. This is why we can't get the economy moving. If you look at the history of every recession ever, at the end of the recession, the economic chart looks like a jet fighter coming off the runway. Straight across and then whoosh. This is the first time ever in history we're not getting that whoosh at the end of the recession. And the reason is we've never been so old at the end of a recession. And remember, they're older than we are in Europe, and in Japan they're older than the Europeans. This is the dirty secret of American politics. No one will mention this. Look, when we were here last, it was just a month or so before the 2012 presidential elections. Those campaigns went on for 4 years. No candidate mentioned this once. No Republican mentioned it. No conservative, no Democrat, no liberal, no libertarian, no green, no independent. No one got around to mentioning what is the single most important economic fact of our country. We're getting old. We have never been so old. Old people don't spend money the way young people spend money. There's your glitch. The 2016 campaigns are going full tilt. I don't know about you, but my mailbox is getting filled every day with requests for donations and things like that. It's never going to come up. They're going to go for another 4 years and never once get around to mentioning that we've never been so old. And there's your glitch. And this is where we came in. This is how this all relates to everything we were talking about. As the world becomes modern, as it comes out of poverty, as we create a global middle class, the customer base for every product and service you've got is growing at a rate of 50 to 100 million new customers every year. If we can connect your products and services with a customer base that's never been there before, is just coming online in effect, and wants everything you've got, we can generate enough economic activity here in the United States to pay off the deficit, clear the debt, and create jobs for all those young people walking up and down California Street. That's how this links together. Let's take a fast look back at where things are going, and then I want to focus on the key issue, which is precisely how you can reorganize your products and services to take advantage of this, and how you can monitor these trends so that your company is ahead of your competitors. But let's just start with the war. We've talked about ISIS and ISIL and all that. We'll just have to deal with it. Meanwhile, Pakistan is a disintegrating nuclear state. This isn't President Obama's fault, it's not President Bush's fault, it's Pakistan's fault. What some of us knew a long time ago, but now everybody knows, there are units of the Pakistani army, the Pakistani intelligence service, that are working with al-Qaeda. That's how they hid bin Laden in plain sight for 10 years. Well, who's got control of Pakistan's nuclear bombs? There are dozens of them, and the short answer is we don't know. There are units of the U.S. Army stationed around Pakistan's borders. They're called snatch teams. And they have one order: if it all goes to hell, just go in and grab the nukes. Where are they? How many? How much time have we got? A disintegrating nuclear state is everyone's nightmare. Don't be surprised if there's something odd in Pakistan, if the military moves in, or if something there wakes everybody up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then you get to the big one. I guess we talked about this last time too. The big one is Iran. It's not Iraq, it's Iran. This is the classic case of nuts with nukes. This is a bunch of us standing outside our kids' school at 5 to 3 waiting to pick up the kids. And we see a visibly deranged man running toward the schoolyard saying, "I'm holding a hand grenade, I hate kids and I love death." Oh, great. What do you want to do? We can keep chatting. Maybe it's a bad joke. Maybe that's not a hand grenade, it's a mango he picked up at Trader Joe's. But if he really is a lunatic and that really is a hand grenade, while we're chatting, he's closing the gap. What we've got with Iran is a bunch of lunatics building a nuclear bomb and talking openly of using it, of trading their cities and populations for ours. That puts you in the lunatic category. When you've got people talking about things like giving up Tehran for Tel Aviv, New York, maybe Denver or San Diego, you're in a whole different category. There are two great lessons of the 20th century. First great lesson is crazy people sometimes get political power. Hitler was crazy. He was brilliant, he was cunning, he was a raving lunatic. The maniacs in Cambodia killed 2 million of their own people. Idi Amin in Uganda. Actually, it's amazing how often crazy people get power in politics. ISIS. The second great lesson of the century is when crazy people with political power tell you what they're going to do, believe them. They're not kidding. And of all the people who learned that lesson, it's the Israelis. You can go back to Germany, 1936, 37, even into 1938, and there were Jewish families that could have gotten out of Germany, and they stayed. They owned businesses. They had lines of credit with their bankers in Frankfurt and Zurich, lived in beautiful homes, belonged to nice clubs, probably had season tickets to the Berlin Philharmonic. And they would meet with each other and they'd say, "Look, these Nazis, that's a bunch of lunatics. It's only quite distasteful." What are they going to do? Kill us all? Yes, as a matter of fact. It's exactly what they did. Should have believed them. The Jewish people won't make that mistake a second time. When the Israeli military and the intelligence service walk into the prime minister's office and say, "We're out of time," the Israelis will launch an attack. Now, whether that's tomorrow, next Tuesday, 18 months from now, I don't know. They're going to launch an attack, and it doesn't matter who the prime minister is. Whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the prime minister now, or a successor, that individual does not want to go down in history as Israel's last prime minister. So they will launch an attack. By the way, I'll tell you something interesting that we didn't talk about last time. About 35 years ago, 40 years ago, in Boston, the Boston Consulting Group did what it always does. It hires some of the top graduate students to be part of their organization. And so they hired the top guy from Harvard Business School and the top guy from the MIT grad school. The one from Harvard was Mitt Romney. The one from MIT grad school was Benjamin Netanyahu. Romney and Netanyahu basically were office mates. They've been friends for 35, 40 years. Boy, was Netanyahu rooting for his office mate 4 years ago. What a difference that would have made. They kept that out of the campaign. They just didn't want to make a big deal about that, but they've been friends for a long time. Well, didn't happen. The Israelis have asked the United States for help with Iran, and we've said no. That's why relations between the Prime Minister and the President got so nasty a few months ago, and why they seem to be getting nastier by the day. Everyone who knows anything about it will tell you the same thing. When the Israelis think they're out of time, they launch. Now, they've just had the war in Gaza that we've been watching on television. That's a prelude to an attack on Iran. The great danger the Israelis face is if they launch and hit Iran, the retaliation is Hamas and Hezbollah firing all their rockets into Israel. Well, they just cleared all those rockets out. So this is not a coincidence that the whole Gaza thing erupted. They're clearing the brush out of the way, so if they have to attack, they'll do everything they can to avoid it. But if they have to attack, they've cleared out the possibility of retaliation. Wouldn't surprise me if there's another kind of low-level war in the Mideast. Again, they're clearing the ground, so if they have to launch the big one, they'll survive it. What is so fascinating about all this is that right now the Saudis are working with the Israelis on the attack on Iran. Not even Tom Clancy would put this in a novel. Okay? The Saudis are not the nicest people in the world, in case you hadn't noticed. They're also not stupid. Their judgment, whether it's right or wrong, it is their political judgment that their regime would not survive a nuclear-armed Tehran. In fact, the not-so-funny joke in the Mideast is that when Iran has the bomb, the first one hits Riyadh and the second one hits Tel Aviv. That's how seriously everybody takes the idea that they go after Saudi Arabia first. So the Saudis are working with the Israelis. You can't make this stuff up. So, you know, buckle your seatbelts. We could be in for some interesting times here. On to the demographics for a few minutes. I hate to say this, but Europe is dying. Obviously, you can reverse low birth rates, but not quickly. A legislature can change the tax rate in an afternoon. You cannot change the birth rate in an afternoon. And the European birth rates are now so low that to get back to the 2.1 replacement level will take 2 generations. You need a bigger generation to have a bigger generation. So if you go home tonight and the headline is European birth rates jump, I doubt it. But if it is, you've started a 40 to 50 year clock. Now, some countries understand the problem. They're trying to deal with it. France, for example. France has the highest birth rate in all of Europe. It's 1.9, same as the United States. Now, that includes the Muslims in France, so the actual indigenous French birth rate is lower than that. So it's way below the replacement level. The French government has decided that the woman most likely to have a child is already the mother of 2. In other words, a mother of 2 is more likely to have a third than is a single 31-year-old career girl likely to have a first child and change her whole life. So in France, if you are the mother of 2 and you're willing to have a third, the French government will pay you about $3,500 a month for 18 years. New program, we'll see what happens. By the way, just when you think the French are brilliant, they do something so blindingly stupid you can't believe it. They've introduced legislation banning psychological violence in marriage. In other words, it is now illegal in France to nag your spouse. And the French police are getting hundreds of phone calls a day with no instructions on how to enforce the law. They're going completely crazy. England's birth rate's below the replacement level, but they're not fixing it. The Journal of the British Medical Association, a magazine that goes to every practicing physician, ran an editorial urging doctors to discourage women patients from having children. It's not going to help. To show you how bad this is in England, last year, the most popular name for a newborn boy in England was Muhammad. Not Henry, Edward, George, John, David, it was Muhammad. Isn't that stunning? Makes my English wife completely crazy. My favorite example, which I probably told you last time, of how you do not solve this problem is Russia. Vladimir Putin is a complete pain in the neck. One thing we all learned growing up in our schoolyards is the only way you stop a bully is you punch his teeth out. Nothing else stops him. This guy's a bully. He's not afraid of anyone, and he's going to keep going until somebody stops him. It's a real problem. But they do understand the demographics. The birth rate in Russia is so low. The lifespan of a Russian man is now under 58 years of age. Population's dropping so fast, by 2050, the population of Russia will be about the same as the population of Yemen, which has a very high birth rate. Yemen's a little place. Russia's nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. As their population plunges below 100 million, there's no way they can defend that border. There's no way they can keep the economy going, so what do? They've declared that from now on, September 12th is officially the day of conception. You're being culturally insensitive again. Under the terms of this proclamation, this is now all of Russia, on September 12th, all workers are given the afternoon off. It's Russia, you shut up and do what you're told when you're told. All workers are given the afternoon off with orders, and I quote, to go home and create a patriot for Russia. By the way, they renamed it. It was called the Day of Conception, but somebody must have gotten to Putin and his predecessor Medvedev and said, you just can't call this the Day of Conception. You've got to come up with something better. So they changed it, but Russian PR is not terrific. The official term for this is the Day of Marital Contact, which strikes me as not a PR improvement. Isn't it great to know other countries are also led by idiots? Bill Casey used to tell us at the CIA when things would go bad, he says, don't worry about it, the other guys make mistakes, and never forget the winner is the guy who made the second to last mistake. It's a good point to keep in mind. Here are the numbers. To sustain a population, the birth rate has to be 2.1. Demographers tell us 1.3 is the suicide rate. In other words, there's no example in history of a country whose birth rate dropped to 1.3, turned it around and got it back up. Today on the European continent, there are 17 countries whose birth rates are at or below 1.3, and so is Japan. Now, there is a gigantic business opportunity emerging from these numbers, and it's this. Products and services for affluent, aging populations without enough young people. In Japan, Honda and Toyota have new divisions devoted precisely to this. They're developing what they call service robots, machines to do for older people what you used to need younger people for. One of their service robots is a machine that automatically bathes a person. When mom or dad can no longer bathe himself or herself, that's when the kids are on the phone at 11 o'clock at night, what do we do now? They're developing machines for that. In Germany, BMW, the automobile company, has opened the first factory they've ever designed explicitly for an older workforce. They put in better lighting, non-skid floors. They developed a whole new set of hand tools because older workers just don't have the physical strength of younger workers. If you say to yourself, wait a minute, in the existing markets, not the new emerging markets, but in the existing markets, the customer base is aging and aging fast. Boy, are there business opportunities. Let me show you what they may be. Give you some examples. The winter before last, I went on a lecture swing to Florida. So my wife Jill came down with me. I do my lectures in the morning. We go out to dinner in the evening, a week in the sun kind of a thing. We were staying in Delray Beach. And it's a nice place to hang out. And whatever the main street is, Atlantic Boulevard, I think, they've got some nice restaurants. The sort of place you go into, dinner for two, $80, $90, bottle of wine, that kind of a place. Well, we went into one of these restaurants. We sat down. They handed us the menus, and it's pitch black in there. I mean, you couldn't see the menu. And then I realized they're playing rock music, loud. and I just can't stand it. And it was so loud we couldn't even talk to each other. So we just put the menus down and we walked out of the restaurant. Place was nearly empty, which means everyone else was doing the same thing. And here's the point. The restaurant was organized by 15-year-olds. Customers was 60. They weren't getting that. Now, a few weeks ago, I was on a business trip, and some people took me out to dinner, as Mickey did last night. And we went into a restaurant, and they were playing Mozart, which I liked a lot better. And when they handed us the menus, they were iPads. You could change the size of the type. You could make it brighter if you needed to. I thought, wow, somebody's on the ball. They're recognizing that the customers can afford this kind of thing and getting older. Make it easy for us. Don't you see all those ads on TV for reading glasses with lights in them and bathtubs with doors on them and beds that go up and down and all that? We're getting older. There's a gigantic market for this stuff. A few weeks ago, Jill said, would you stop tightening jars when you put them in the refrigerator? Not that I'm tightening jars, but the older we get, you lose your physical strength. Well, they're coming up with all kinds of, fancy jar openers that they sell. It won't be long before you go to the mall, and there's the old geezer shop. And with all these products and services that older people need. When my mom was getting older, she lived till almost 99, she spent a lot of time with us. And as she lost her hearing, she kept turning up the volume on the television set. It made us completely crazy. We couldn't stand it. So I went to Radio Shack. I got her a set of these wireless headphones. She could have it as loud as she wanted. We didn't have to hear it. It was great. Mom's long since gone now. We've started using the headphones. Well, getting older. As soon as you say, wait a minute, my customers are getting old, there's all kinds of products and services we want. And I'll give you another example. In our house, we built it quite some time ago, and it's got one of those fans that just rotates in the living room and just keeps the air circulating. And a couple of times a year, you stop the fan, you get a ladder, you go out and you clean off the blades. They get kind of crummy and sticky. So I was getting the ladder out of the garage, and Jill said, don't do that. I said, why not? She said, because if you fall off that ladder, you're going to have to cancel 4 months of your lecture tour. And who knows what else will happen to you. She said, it's just not worth it. I'll hire somebody to do it. Now, this is interesting. I'm in good physical shape. I go out for a hard bike ride every day. I'm not fragile. But guys like me fall off ladders. In fact, a friend of mine did. I'll probably never get up on that ladder again. And every so often I get the ladder out and I clear the leaves out of the gutters around the house. I'll bet I never do that again. As your customer base ages, there are certain things that it's not that we cannot do it, but maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to do it. And so we don't. That's a gigantic market emerging. Older people fall inside their homes. People fall. And you fall, you break a hip, your life changed, the lives of your adult children changed because now mom or dad is a half cripple. What they've discovered in Canada is that the reason so many older people are falling in their own homes, it's not that you lose vision, it's depth perception. You just miss it. You just put your foot down on the step the wrong way, you go flying. Well, what they've discovered is if you paint a strip, like that white strip that's along there, or you could even just put a water glass, anything, at the edge of the step like that, because it's a depth perception issue, your eye sees it and you don't miss the step. Well, there's a gigantic business now of retrofitting houses and apartments because we're living longer, the kids are grown, but we're on our own, we're not ready for a nursing home. They're painting lines on steps, they're putting in different color tiles in bathrooms. All these things to accommodate our problems with depth perception. They're putting in better lighting because we're losing our eyesight. At precisely that moment when we're getting older and losing our eyesight, they're taking away 100-watt bulbs. It's just not brilliant. Right after we were here 2 years ago, remember that was in the middle of the presidential campaign, I was trying to call a friend of mine at the National Republican Committee. Say, tell Romney, go to Florida and say, if you vote for me, you can keep your 100-watt bulbs. He'd have won Florida, he'd be president now. Alas, the National Republican Committee has never taken a phone call in its life. But there is a gigantic business of retrofitting homes and providing services to people like me and some of you that we used to do ourselves, we're perfectly capable of doing ourselves, but we don't want to do anymore because it's a little dangerous and we all have a friend who fell off a ladder or did something like that. I'll give you another example. You get to be my age and you have more medical appointments. And they're the kind of appointments where you cannot drive because of anesthesia, colonoscopy, for example, in some cases dental appointments. Well, you know, taking a taxi isn't terrific. First, getting one. Second, you've had this colonoscopy. 10 minutes after you come out of the anesthesia, you're on the street. You call it, you know, taxi stops, the driver can't speak English. And he says, where you want to go? And you give him the address where you lived when you were 14 years old. You know, you think you're fine, but, you know, you were under the anesthesia 10 minutes ago. By the way, this happens. Well, the reason I'm mentioning this is I know companies now, what they're setting up, it's limo service, not for executives to get the DIA, drive people like me to medical and dental appointments. It's all part of the appointment. You make your appointment with a doctor or a dentist, they set it up for a car to pick you up and take you home. Do you realize the psychological load that takes off older people? You will be taken there safely and brought home safely. You don't have to remember anything. You have no idea what a load that takes off. And by the way, it takes a load off my kid in Boston because you don't have to worry about mom or dad. So that's turning into an interesting business. Things like that. As soon as you say the customer base is aging, it's affluent, it's aging, the kind of products and services we want in our homes, food service, transportation, almost everything you can think of. I'm in the publishing business, and a lot of the people who are buying ebooks are older people, and they're buying ebooks because they can change the size of the type and the brightness of the screen. It's not the kids who want them so much, it's the older people. So if you just stop for a second and think, wait a minute, my customer base is much older than it used to be. It's affluent, but they need different products and service. They need them different ways. Look, I'm always running through airport terminals. I'm sure a lot of you are. You know, I just can't wolf down the Wendy's double cheeseburger anymore. Just can't do it. I'm willing to pay a lot more for something that's a lot better, that suits me better. And yet you're racing through the terminal and it's the Pizza Hut and the Cinnabon and all that. It's not what I want. They're just not recognizing that we're getting older. That's a gigantic market. Don't ignore that. But the real market is the one we'll get to a little later. As the world becomes modern, as it comes out of poverty, as we create a global middle class, if we can connect your products and services with that emerging and gigantic customer base, we will create more activity here in Colorado, in the United States, than anyone has ever imagined. That's what I want to turn to next. But let's stop for a minute, let's take a break, catch a cup of coffee and catch up on your phone calls, and then we'll be back. Thank you.
We'll start again in 15 minutes. Just be back in 15 minutes and we'll get started again. If you would, please have a seat and help me bring back our keynote speaker for the second half of his presentation. At the end of the presentation, again, we'll fill out the feedback form. We'll do a quick question and answer session and have you all out of here well in advance of noon. So if you would, please help me welcome back Herb Meyer.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you again. When we were chatting over there, somebody came up and said, would you just forget all this demographic and political stuff and tell us a couple of spy stories? You know, if we start that, we're going to be here all night. And I don't want to blow security, but there is one that an audience like this might appreciate more than your average Rotary Club audience. If you can remember, if you're old enough to remember in the 1980s and the Reagan years, we were very active supporting anti-communist insurgencies in Central America, in El Salvador, Nicaragua. Well, from time to time, our covert people had to meet with their covert action people and coordinate, get things going. So a clandestine meeting was set up between our guys and their guys at a hotel near Miami. When you show up for a clandestine CIA meeting at a hotel, you don't go up to the front desk and give them your CIA Visa card to check in. You've got false ID, and you pay cash. That way there's no record that the meeting ever took place. Well, everyone comes in from all over the world for the meeting. They're up in a hotel room. And as happens, the meeting went on longer than everybody thought. So our senior guy turned to one of the junior guys and said, call down the front desk. Tell them to send up a tray of sandwiches and some cold drinks. So the kid calls down and places the order. 2 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. It's the hotel manager. He says, I'm sorry, I can't fill that order. You guys are CIA. Total panic. I mean, one of the guys sort of jumped off the balcony and lowered himself down, with the sheet from the bed. Another guy was down the corridor, down the back staircase, under the, through the underground garage. And I mean, these guys just cleared out of there as fast as they could. It's a disaster. Wasn't until they came back to Washington and told us what happened, we were able to explain to them. In the hotel business, CIA means cash in advance. Our bad days at the office were not like your bad days at the office. Oh, well. Let's turn back to business. We want the world to emerge from poverty as much as it wants to emerge from poverty, because that's the market for our products and services, so we have a common interest here. There's a problem. If we go about this clumsily, the water's going to be polluted, you can't drink it, the air's going to be filthy, we're going to be choking on it, and it'll be a disaster. But the one thing we can never say to these people trying to come out of poverty is, sorry, too late, I've got a big house, 2 SUVs, you can't, it'll pollute. That's inhuman, it's just wrong. The trick is to bring the world out of poverty without wrecking the planet. Isn't that an interesting problem? And the solution that's emerging is this. We do it by creating products and services that are clever, inexpensive, and green. That's why you keep hearing these words. This is no longer an environmental issue. This is now the core driving issue of global business, to bring the world out of poverty and to do it without trashing the planet. You know IKEA, but you've probably never seen the IKEA house because they don't sell it in North America. It's about 900 square feet, looks exactly the way you think an IKEA house would look. You can't quite put it on top of your car and drive it home, but close. And you assemble it on a slab, probably with the same stupid black wrench you use for everything else. Clever, inexpensive, materials don't rot in a hot climate. That's brilliant. It's a company in China with a very small house. It's even got the plumbing and the wiring in it. You screw it together and plug it in. Clever, inexpensive, green. In India, the Tata Group announced it will invent a new kind of housing module for the world's emerging middle class. Each module will sell for the equivalent of $8,600. I don't want one, I'm sure you don't. Don't bet against the Tata people, they're very clever. They launched the Nano, the $2,500 car for the emerging middle class. Not a big success, as early entry products often aren't, but it opened up a whole new category. Now Datsun has announced a $3,000 car for the emerging middle class. Honda just announced a $500 motorcycle. The Japanese Trade Ministry issued a directive to all companies. They said, develop products and services for a customer base that has between $9 and $24 a day disposable income. Look, you and I can go to Costco or Walmart. You get this gigantic box of laundry soap. It's cheap, but still it's 12 bucks. You need 12 bucks. If you have $14 a day disposable income, $12 is a problem. Well, the big packaging companies like Procter & Gamble have developed all new packaging. You never see it in our part of the world. It's very inexpensive, and they're packaging it in smaller doses so you can come back every few days and get a little bit more. If you have very little disposable income, that's how you do that. Another example are ebooks. Now, I'm in the publishing business. If you want one of my books, well, great. Buy the book. I'll cut down a tree to make the book for you and then burn fuel shipping it to you on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or just download the ebook. Same content, no environmental damage, and a fraction of the cost. When Mickey introduced me, he mentioned my 2 new ebooks, How to Analyze Information, The Cure for Poverty. They're $1.99. And last I checked, Amazon was selling one of them for, I think, 99 cents. Look, even I can get more than 99 cents out of somebody in an audience. But the reason they're priced so low is because while I'm standing here talking to you in Denver, there are young people all over the world who are downloading those books onto their iPads or their cell phones, and 99 cents is the right price for them. And in the long run, there are more of them than there are of you. And by the way, Amazon came to us publishers a little while ago. They're opening a Kindle store in India. Kindle is their ebook store. And they said, would you drop the price even further on your ebooks? Well, your first thought is, give me a break. Half a rupee per copy isn't much of a profit. But then you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and think, wait a minute, they got 1 billion people over there. A lot of young people in colleges using my books. Yeah, it's a pretty good deal. In other words, you suddenly stop and you rethink your products and services. How can you recreate them so that they're clever, inexpensive, and green? And in some cases, make them available in smaller doses or whatever that would mean in your business, so that people who are just coming out of poverty, don't have as much disposable income as we do, can afford to buy it. It's a different way to think about business. But that's one way to get to this gigantic market. Now, if we're going to bring the world out of poverty, we're going to need an unbelievable amount of energy, fuel. People are going to live decently, not as nicely as you live or I live, but they're going to live decently. That means we've got to light up those houses and apartments. You've got to cool them. You've got to heat them. They're going to have appliances. Do you realize how many factories are being built to provide the goods and services for all these 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 billion people coming out of poverty? Well, factories use fuel, and that means trucks on the road. It means people getting to work, cars, buses, trains, motor scooters. The amount of fuel we will have to extract from the planet to bring 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 billion people out of poverty in the next 30, 35 years is beyond anything anyone's ever imagined. Conservation is terrific. All for it, do it any way we can. It's got nothing to do with this. Whether this means drilling for oil, coal, natural gas, biofuels, wind, nuclear, solar, my guess is all of the above, plus some things we haven't quite figured out yet. But keep this point in mind. There is no way to bring the world out of poverty without extracting more fuel from Earth than anyone has ever believed possible. We're also going to need food, in particular protein. In the last 8 years, meat consumption in China more than doubled. It's a lot of cows and pigs. Well, they eat corn, corn prices go up, food prices go up. By the way, turns out when people come out of poverty, they eat bread. Just human beings eat bread. If the price of bread goes up in Denver, it will make no difference in how much bread you or I eat. 3 years ago in January, the world price of wheat kicked over the line to where the poor people in Cairo could not afford their daily loaf of bread. That was the trigger that set off the revolution in Egypt. And by the way, to produce enough food for several billion more people takes a lot of fuel. To plant that food, to harvest it, to transport it, to process it, to distribute it, to refrigerate it. And there are some revolutions taking place in energy and food. And energy, of course, fracking. Food, we have a couple of revolutions going on. genetically engineered seeds. If we're going to have to feed billions of more people, you have to increase yield per acre. There's enough acreage out there, not unless you plow up New Jersey. So you have to increase yield per acre. Also, the big food companies like Nestle, the big international companies, are doing some technological things that have not become public yet. They're quite extraordinary. They're developing new kinds of protein products, protein bars. Not the kind of protein bar you buy at a 7-Eleven before you go for a hike, but protein bars out of Star Trek. Just extraordinarily advanced food products to feed billions of people coming out of poverty very efficiently. This is really remarkable stuff. There's an interesting political component to this. The environmentalists are against anything that gets more energy out of the ground, and they're against new food technologies like the genetically engineered seeds that increase yield per acre. Their argument is they're trying to protect the earth. The other side of that argument is, yeah, but you just condemned 8 billion people to perpetual poverty. That is not a side of the argument they want to be on. And you can almost feel the political ground shifting now to where the people in these emerging countries are saying, get real. We need the fuel. We need the protein. Please don't deny it to us. So there are real political revolutions here along with the technical revolutions. As the world emerges from poverty, there is a gigantic market for infrastructure. Power stations, water treatment plants, bridges, roads, houses, whole new cities, shopping centers, office complexes, malls. Just get in the car and drive around. Everything you see is what it takes to be a middle-class society. All this stuff, the strip malls, everything you can think of. Well, that's being built now in countries all over the world at a rate of construction no one has ever imagined. As people emerge from poverty, they buy health care. They buy education. Because we're human beings, they buy entertainment. So the growth industries of the 21st century are energy, food, infrastructure, healthcare, education, and entertainment. And if you look at those industries through the prism of clever and expensive and green, that's how your customer base can start to grow and reach a market that's expanding at 50 to 100 million customers every year. The two countries that have really led the way on all this are China and India. And things are changing very fast in both countries since we were together 2 years ago. China's hit the wall. What China has accomplished in the last 30 years is extraordinary. Look how many people they brought out of poverty. I don't think there's another country in history that brought that many people out of poverty so quickly. It's an extraordinary human achievement. And by the way, just to show you how you can contrast it, in Egypt, I don't think Mubarak brought one Egyptian out of poverty in all the years he ruled. That's a stupid dictator. In China, they're smart. Look at the difference in how many people they brought out of poverty. Well, China's changing fast. By the way, it is no longer accurate to describe China as a communist country. It's a chamber of commerce with guns, a slightly different thing. The Chinese economic model is very simple. We make it happen for you, we give you cheap labor. Now, either you've been through this or you know someone who has. We had dinner with these guys in Shanghai 3 years ago. We signed contracts. 6 months later, factory was open. This country, it takes 8 years to file an environmental impact statement. It's true. Do you know how they got the factory open in 6 months? They shot everyone who objected to it. Ran tanks right over them. Turns out, peasants don't like being shot. Who knew? Now China's very middle class. You just can't send in tanks over middle-class people. And the result is that the level of political protest in China in just the last couple of years has expanded exponentially. People protest this highway project. The city of Wuhan was an open revolt against Beijing last year, I think because of a chemical plant they wanted to put in, or this power station. And to its credit, China's not sending in the tanks. You just can't roll tanks over middle-class people. It just doesn't work. So they can't make things happen the way they used to. Now, the other part of the Chinese bargain is we give you cheap labor. Well, as I'm sure you know, and we discussed last time, China has a one-child per family policy. Birth rate's 1.1. China is the most rapidly aging country on Earth. Oops. Japan had the very good sense to get rich before it got old. China's trying to do it the other way around. Good luck. The Chinese population is aging. Remember what I told you about Spain and Italy? If your birth rate's 1.3, in 20 years you lose 30% of your entire working age population. China's birth rate's lower than Spain and Italy. Last year, for the first time in Chinese history, the working age population shrank. Now this is math, not politics. Well, the working age population is now shrinking at an accelerating rate. And that's why wages are going through the roof. So suddenly the whole Chinese model hit the wall. They can't make it happen for you because you can't push people around the way they used to. And now they can't even give you cheap labor to do it with. And that's why so many companies are having second thoughts about manufacturing in China. They're moving it to other countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, even Burma, or they're just bringing it back to the United States. That's why it took China about 6 months to come up with a government last year. They didn't know what the hell to do. They're in a complete panic over this. And you can see this playing out. I live on the West Coast now. From San Diego all the way north to Vancouver, real estate agents are reporting the same thing, which is affluent Chinese people, people like you, are buying homes. And what they're telling the real estate people is, we think China could blow in 5 to 6 years. I need a place to run. I think that's overly dramatic. I don't think China's going to blow apart in 5 or 6 years. But when people like you say something like that, that's interesting. That's not nothing. They want a place to run. Have you noticed how many Chinese students are in the United States now? Not just at the university level where you'd expect it, but at the high school, even at the middle school level. To some extent, it's fashionable in China and it's good education. But there's another reason behind it that nobody wants to talk about. The way the laws are written, if your child is enrolled in school in the United States, that kid is here legally. The visas are done properly. Under the law, if your child is here, we will let the parents in. So what they're basically doing is pre-positioning their kids in the United States in case they have to make a run for it. That's how much trouble China is in right now. Keep your eye on India. India's coming up fast on the outside. The birth rate, by the way, is 2.8, above the 2.1 replacement level. India is a democracy. They speak English. They've got the rule of law. India's made one of the most crucial decisions in modern history. For 50 years, all India wanted was to lead the third world. Drove everyone crazy. What India says now is, they've outgrown that. We want to sit at the head table. Good, India belongs at the head table. I think India is going to blow past China. You know, the Indian middle class is now over 300 million people, bigger than the US population. Democracies are slow to get going, but when they get going, they tend to be steadier than dictatorships. If you know India, it has a lot of corruption, the roads are awful, the power grid is a mess, they got all kinds of problems they got to fix. And when you contrast India and China, it's almost comical. Walmart goes to China, and they say, we want to put a Walmart up right there at the edge of Beijing. China says, great. They go out, they shoot everyone who objects to it. 6 months later, Walmart's open. Walmart goes to India. They say, we want to put a Walmart up right there at the edge of New Delhi. Every shopkeeper in New Delhi is out protesting Walmart, and the richer ones are sending letters to their member of parliament saying, you let that happen, it's the last campaign contribution you ever get from me. So the Indian parliament panicked. They passed a law banning Walmart. They banned Walmart, IKEA, and another big box store. It's a democracy. Everybody woke up the next morning and said, gee, that's kind of stupid. So they're figuring out how to repeal part of the law, how to modify it. Walmart sent a facilitator to calm down the shopkeepers. The same poor guy they sent to San Francisco when they didn't want a Walmart there. Democracies get there eventually. By the way, India has had an election in just the last couple of months, which has changed everything. The new prime minister is named Narendra Modi. If this were the United States, we would say he was a Tea Party candidate. He is economically conservative. He wants to get the finances under control. He wants to fix these things and get it moving for business. It's politics. We'll see if he has the talent and the skill to maneuver and do it. But boy, is this getting exciting. And there's a real feeling that India could blow past China. Now look, do business with both. They've got gigantic middle-class societies that want everything you've got. One difference is this. As the decades go by, because the birth rates are so different, China's next middle class will be smaller. India's next middle class will be bigger. And this gets into something that is a little bit sticky, which is why everyone avoids talking about it. But it's absolutely crucial. There have been some changes in the last couple of years, so I want to get into this with you. And it's back to the demographics. And before I give you the demographics, I'll give you a short lesson in biology. When we have children, you get 103 boys for every 100 girls. That's the human ratio. It's not American versus Oriental. It's not Republican versus Democrat. The human ratio is that 103 boys are born to every 100 girls. Well, today we have the technology to know which is which. Virtually everywhere in the world, expectant parents can now know the sex of an unborn child. In India and China, there's a cultural preference for boys, so they abort the girls. So many that in India and China, instead of having the normal human ratio of 103 boys to every 100 girls, the ratio is 118 boys to every 100 girls. In some provinces, it's 130 boys to every 100 girls, and there's a province of China that's reported a ratio of 192 boys to every 100 girls. What this means in real numbers is that in these countries, there are nearly 100 million boys growing up who will never find wives. That's unprecedented. Usually when you have a gender imbalance, you've lost the men in a war. They've lost the women. Let me tell you, the single most destabilizing force in the world is a bunch of unmarried men. There's no example of unmarried women knocking over a 7-Eleven or setting off a car bomb. It doesn't happen. India and China are in panic mode. Both governments have made it a crime for an obstetrician to disclose the sex of an unborn child. They're taking all the sonogram machines out of the countries, by the way. China says by 2050, the gender gap will be about 200 million. The thought of 200 million single guys hitting Shanghai and Beijing on Friday nights is terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And it takes some of the oddest bumps you've ever seen. There's a new industry in China. If this were the Shanghai CEO forum, these guys would be here. What these companies do is they fly Chinese bachelors to other countries to find wives. They load up the 747s on Friday night with bachelors in Shanghai, Beijing, fly them over to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and they've arranged receptions at the hotels with the Vietnamese girls, and they cut the deals. I don't mean they cut them Friday night, but these companies arrange the transportation, the introductions, courtships, marriages, immigration. Chinese men are sweeping across Asia, bringing back gigantic numbers of wives from other countries. And the men in these countries don't like it. These are their daughters, these are their sisters. They've done Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and it's just causing a complete mess. And it's interesting, you know, human nature doesn't change. That's why we call it human nature. People are the same. The caregivers for aging parents aren't the sons and the sons-in-law. It's the daughters and the daughters-in-law. Everybody knows that. China today has 165 million old people. They have no health insurance of any kind, no pensions of any kind. And very few daughters because they aborted them. And since they aborted their daughters, their sons can't find wives. They haven't got daughters-in-law. So you've got this aging couple in Beijing or Shanghai. They got one son. This idiot is sitting at a Starbucks. And they call them and say, would you get in touch with one of these companies? fly to somewhere else, and come back with a wife to take care of us. That's what's happening. China says by 2025, there will be about 250 million old people in China. No health insurance, no pensions of any kind. It's a disaster. They've just started signing contracts with American companies to build senior care facilities because they don't know how to do that. They just assume people take care of their parents. Well, no kids, you can't take care of parents. And by the way, the senior care facilities that they're building, they're bigger than the Marriott down here. I mean, we're talking about senior care facilities the size of small cities. It's an extraordinary change. Now, you may have seen in the papers, they've just started to change the one child per family policy. It's much too early to see what effect this will be, how it will work. The early indicators are not good. There's an expression in China called the emperor child, meaning you have one child, but that kid gets everything. And those young couples say they don't want to have a second one because it would bring down their standard of living. We'll see. It's just beginning, but they're sort of slowly changing it. But biology being what it is, if this rising young generation of Chinese men and women do want to have bigger families, it would take 30, 40, 50 years for there to be a statistical difference. By the way, it takes some other odd bumps. Just a few weeks ago, they passed a new law in China. If you are an only child, which is virtually everyone right now, by law, you must be in touch with your parents once every 90 days, either by telephone or in person. That's the law. China being China, companies have emerged to outsource this. So if taking dad out to supper or spending a half hour on the phone with mom is more than you can bear, you call one of these companies and they'll do it for you. You can't make this up. There's a huge debate in China now as to whether or not this is okay. Believe me, China's not the world's next superpower. If you were my age, you can remember in the late 70s, early 80s, I don't think a month went by without a conference at some swishy hotel in San Francisco or London on how Japan was going to take over the world. Remember those? Been to any lately? China's not taking over the world. Now, keep your eye on India, as I say, coming up very fast on the outside. And with a new government that seems to understand business and economics, well, people are really paying a lot of attention. They've also got problems because of the demographics. If you're a 28-year-old programmer in New Delhi with an MBA, life's good right now. You're busy. You've got some cash in your pocket. It's very hard to find a wife because of all the girls who've been aborted. But you can rent a wife. India has a wife rental industry. And the way it works is this. Why are you looking at me like that? I don't make this up. The way it works is this. If you have a wife, but you want some extra income, you register your wife with one of these companies, like registering your property with a real estate agent. And if you can't find a wife, you can rent one. On average, it's a 3-month rental at $175 a month. The average income being $22 a month. That's real money. India had a woman president until a couple of years ago. In their system, the prime minister is the head of the government. That's the new guy, Modi. The president is the head of state. And in India, like a lot of countries, they elect the head of state. She's a very capable woman. She had said that since they made it a crime for an obstetrician to disclose the sex of an unborn child, more girls were in fact being born. That was the whole point. According to the president of India, each day, more than 7,000 newborn girls are being murdered by their own parents. That's her statistic. They've set up a network of refuges all over India. And the way it works now is this. If you've given birth to a daughter and you don't want her, don't kill her, drop her off. The state will raise her in hopes of shifting the ratio back. I was talking to a Vistage group in Texas a while ago, and one of the members of their group is working with one of these refuges through his church. These are things you just won't see in the newspapers. In the last couple of hours, we've made about 35 orbits around the planet, and I wanted to cover a lot of territory quickly. You've been very patient. Here's what you do with all this. Over the next few days or few weeks, think about what we've talked about. Each of you will focus on something that's most directly relevant to whatever business you're in. If you're in the defense industry, the war is entering a dicey stage. You may want to look at aging populations here in the United States and Japan and Europe and say, how can I alter my products and services for an aging population? If you're in the energy business, well, world demand for energy is unlike anything we've ever seen. If you're in the infrastructure business, you need to know what's being built where, because middle-class societies are being virtually constructed overnight. Or healthcare. A friend of mine is a medical device inventor, fairly successful one. He's working with a group now. They believe they can develop a pacemaker that's very inexpensive, much less expensive than the one you or I would get if they took us to the hospital here this evening. Well, if they can do that, the market for that in developing countries will be just gigantic. You want to look at healthcare, education, entertainment, whatever is in the business you're in. You may think, gee, I've been looking at China, I really should look more at India. You'll all focus on whatever is most relevant to you. If what I've told you is accurate, now you're going to see things you never saw before. Let me tell you the biggest secret of intelligence. You have to know what you're looking for. Once you know what you're looking for, you can see it. And in the days, weeks ahead, you'll see more things about what we were talking about. You have to ask the most important question a chief executive can ask. So what? What does this information mean to my business? In other words, if everything I've told you, if things you'll see that you wouldn't have seen before, is there an opportunity that you hadn't realized was there for your business? And if the answer is yes, well, what are you going to do about it? Remember, the whole purpose of knowing what the future is so you can change the future before it happens. And that's the whole purpose of this morning's intelligence briefing. From the moment you decide to change the future, you've thrown the switch from playing defense to playing offense. In the Cold War, for example, we in the West played defense for 35 years. All anybody wanted was to not lose the Cold War. If when you left office things were not much worse than when you took office, well, you did a good job. In 1979, 1980, all that changed. The three most unlikely individuals stepped onto the world stage simultaneously. Polish Pope John Paul, woman Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and that actor from Hollywood. And the three of them said, we don't want to keep not losing, we want to win. In other words, they threw the switch from playing defense to playing offense. That was the great shift that changed the course of world history. 9 years later, the Berlin Wall was down. 2 years after that, Cold War was over. It's the same in business. Sometimes you play defense. The economy isn't great. It's all you can do to keep the business together, keep cash coming in, keep your customers or your clients on board. If you have to lay off people, you do it as carefully, as decently as you can. We've all played defense. It's very, very difficult professionally, and it's emotionally exhausting and draining. In the long run, whether you're fighting a global war or running a local business, you want to win, play offense. And the whole point of this morning's intelligence briefing is to get you thinking about offense or defense. I'll give you an exercise that helps you think about this. One afternoon when you're sitting in your office, just close the door, put your cell phone on silent or vibrate, and mentally elevate yourself to 100 feet, looking straight down on your business, and ask a question. Is my business playing offense or defense? Objectively, are we playing offense or defense? Next question, which should we be playing? If it's not the right one, how are you going to throw the switch? Now, I know a number of you are members of Vista, so you're sitting around with a group. You can do this with the Vista group. And somebody in the group says, well, you're playing offense or defense? And you say, oh, I'm playing offense. Everyone in the group says, really? If you were playing offense, you'd have done that and that. You didn't do that. Now, what's offense to one member of the group and offense to another company? Well, they're different things. And someone says, well, how come you never did that? Or you may say to your fellow members of the group or your board of directors, Look, it's been a tough few years here. We're just hanging on. We've been playing defense. And then someone says, really? If you were really worried and playing defense, you'd have done this. You never did that. Or, look, you've done a great job playing defense the last few years. But, you know, in the last 6 months, things have started to pick up. Things are turning around a little bit. I know a lot of companies that have been playing defense, and now they're throwing the switch to offense, and you guys don't show any sign of throwing the switch. Why haven't you done that? This gets to be a very, very interesting conversation. You can have it with your Vistage group. You can have it with your key executives. You can have it with your board of directors or just people you trust to talk to. You've got to have this conversation out loud. You've got to reach an agreement on whether, in fact, your business is playing offense or defense, objectively. And the next question, which should we be playing right now? I've been through this kind of exercise dozens of times with people like you, probably hundreds, and it's an interesting pattern. I'll have lunch with the chief executive, and I'll say, playing offense or defense? CEO says, oh, offense. 3 o'clock, I'll meet with the key executives. I say, you playing offense or defense? Key executive says, well, defense, of course. I said, why are you playing defense? Oh, that's what my boss wants. Really? I just had lunch with him. He thinks you're playing offense. Oh, I never heard that. Don't assume the people you work with see it the same way you do. Not if you haven't had this conversation. They may not have picked up the signals you've sent. It might not have been as clear. They may be playing off a different set of rules. And by the way, I've been through this at a very high level. If you're old enough to remember the Reagan administration, the fights we had inside the administration were they were volcanic. And everyone kept thinking, oh, it's liberals against conservatives and that kind of thing. No, it wasn't. There were no liberals in the Reagan administration. Everyone was going to conservative. The difference was this. A lot of the people on the national security side, they were playing defense. They grew up, and their whole careers were based on a world of not losing the Cold War. That's what they knew how to do, which is to not lose the Cold War. Reagan came in and said, let's win the damn thing. Threw the switch to offense. And you know, playing offense and playing defense are completely different things. And the number of people in the Reagan administration who wanted to play offense was much smaller than the number who, well, their whole careers were built on defense. That was what the Titanic battles were about. It wasn't liberal versus conservative, it was offense and defense. And if you've been playing defense as a company and you want to throw the switch to offense, be very careful that there are people working for you. They've done a great job playing defense. You owe them a lot, but defense is what they know how to play. And getting people who've played defense to throw the switch to offense, some people can do it and some people can't. But this is a conversation you need to have. I'll tell you one more thing you ought to do. Let's assume you're now playing offense. In other words, you want to change the future before it happens rather than just be at the mercy of the future. Develop for your company an intelligence profile. And the profile is a document that answers one question. What information do we need to accomplish our strategic objective? What do we need to know? We wanted to win the Cold War. We needed to know about the Soviet Union's economy. We needed to know about their weapons. In other words, we made a very careful list of what we needed to know. Where were they vulnerable? Where could we hurt them? What were the hidden strengths we didn't know? Once you know where you're going, you can say, what do I need to know to get there? Well, that's your question. You have a strategic objective. You have a plan. Fine. Well, what information is relevant to getting you there? And write it out. First, you put in some categories. Competitors. You have to know about your competitors. Well, who are your competitors? Just make a list of them. And to show you how this works itself out, you make a list of your competitors. But then it gets a little more interesting. Give you an example. Years ago, I was working with Harley-Davidson. Their competitors are obviously other motorcycle manufacturers. But wait a minute. Very few people buy a Harley-Davidson to get to work. Affluent guys in their 30s, 40s, 50 buy a Harley because it's fun to drive a Harley around. That's what you like to do. In other words, they want to do with their money. Well, what happens if you want to do something other than ride a motorcycle? As I'm sure you've noticed, bicycling is becoming a very big deal now among people. So you've got a lot of people who would have bought a motorcycle, Harley or otherwise, but now they're buying very expensive bicycles, sort of titanium, plutonium sort of thing. So the competitor for a Harley isn't just another motorcycle manufacturer. It's someone who's selling a different product that the same customer may suddenly prefer. So when you say, who am I competing against, it gets to be very interesting. It's the direct competitors, obviously. But then against who may come up next. Who's competing with you for your customers' time, attention, money? We'll start to make that kind of a list. Who are your customers? You may sell to other businesses. Those are your customers. But then you can extend it a little bit and say, who are my customers' customers? Because if you know who the customer's customers are, you can serve your customer better. In fact, you may know more about his customers than he knows. You need to know about suppliers. Markets. What markets are you in now? What markets might you be in? You might be looking at the American market, but based on what we've talked about this morning, well, suddenly you're interested in third world markets, the 7 out of 10 African countries with the world's highest growth rates that you never looked at before. So what markets? What are the key trends you need to follow to accomplish your objective? If you're in the healthcare business, well, a lot of trends going on in the whole healthcare field, or in the banking, financial fields, things like that. What are the key trends? Make this list. And by the way, you don't have to do it in 10 minutes. Make a list and then sit around with some of your key executives, and again, it could be your advisors, Vistage Group, board of directors, and work on the list. It's a living document. Somebody wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning and says, we need to keep an eye on that, and here's why. Or that company could actually turn out to be a competitor of ours 5 years from now. Or what if these guys and those guys merge and that changes everything? That's fine. Modify the list. I mean, computer type is easy. Just do it. But develop this profile so that you can say, gee, if I were aware of these things, I'm in much better shape to accomplish my objective. That's your intelligence profile. And it's a living document. It's never perfect. You change it as you go. And then do one more thing. Develop in your company a regularly scheduled intelligence briefing. Okay? And what it means is this. Say, look, guys, once a month, say every Friday at 4 o'clock, or whatever works for you. You may have a quarterly meeting or something. But say once every Friday, last Friday of every month, 4 o'clock, we'll meet in the boardroom. It's you, your top executives, whoever you think should be there, roughly a dozen people. Let's just go through the profile. In the last month, what have we seen about our competitors? What's new? What's interesting? Nothing? Okay, fine. Let's go on to the customers. Anybody see anything there? And work your way through the profile. I can tell you from experience that when people know what you want to know, they know what to look for, and the key executives you work with, they're out all the time. They're dealing with your competitors, your customers, your suppliers, markets, trends. They're out there, but they don't know what you want to know. Now you're telling them. And if you tell them when you want to know it, which is the fourth Friday of every month at 4 o'clock, whatever it is, they get it. No one walks into that meeting knowing absolutely nothing. You just see, gee, next Friday's that meeting, what have I got? And when we just go around the table, nobody wants to say, I haven't seen anything in a month. That's like not a career-enhancing thing to say. The information that will come into you is enormous. I'm not talking about secrets here. I'm just talking about things your people pick up. But when you set a special meeting aside, again, whether you do it weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever works for you, say, let's just run through the profile. What have we seen here? And what does it mean to us? Now you're working with intelligence. And the question every time somebody sees something is, well, what does that mean? So for example, if you're in the motorcycle business and one of the things you noticed, Somebody mentioned it to you on the weekend, you saw it in the newspapers, that sales of high-tech bicycles are going through the roof and more people are doing it. Well, what it means is, do we want to buy one of these cycle companies or do we want to develop our own? That's a business decision that you have to decide what to do. But now you're asking the right question. You're ahead of it rather than behind it. That's what it means to play offense. So decide what you're playing, develop an intelligence profile that answers the question, what do you need to know to accomplish your objectives, and then work that profile with the senior members of your staff, with your advisors, with your board of directors, if that's appropriate. And now you're operating the way a first-class business organization should work, which is you're changing the future before it happens, rather than being at the mercy of events and you just have to respond. Let me make 2 points and then we'll just open it up for your questions. It's easy to be a pessimist right now. God knows we're going through tumultuous time. The economy isn't great. The levels of debt are staggering. As we talked about earlier, the war isn't ending. You know, Al-Qaeda's not on the ropes and all these things. We've got all kinds of problems. And again, I don't mean to make this political, but whether we elect Democrats or Republicans, Washington doesn't change. It's an odd town. The genius to square foot ratio is not that high. It's not Florence in 1500. We make mistakes. So it's easy to be a pessimist. And it's also very fashionable to be a pessimist right now. Among intellectuals, if you can see a problem nobody else sees, that must mean you're smarter than everybody else. I was telling someone the other day, on the day our scientists announce a cure for cancer, it's going to be a talking head on Fox News telling us why this is terrible, terrible news. It's going to live longer. It's going to bankrupt Social Security. I mean, give me a break, you know. So you're just always surrounded by bad news, and this is bad, and that's wrong. Don't let it get you. You have to fight off the pessimism. That's the sea we swim in at the moment. If instead of looking out the windshield at all this turbulence we're going through and being bothered by it, you look down at the radar screen so you can see through the turbulence, which we will get through, to the other side, this is the world we're heading for. Within your lifetimes, certainly within the lifetimes of your children, the world will cross a line that's never been crossed before, that most people never even imagined could be approached. For the first time in history, the overwhelming majority of human beings will not be poor. Isn't that stunning? At least half of you sitting here today will live to see that world. If you don't, your children will. Wow. And there isn't a single kid wandering down the street out there who's being told this. Holy cow. As the world becomes modern, as it comes out of poverty, we will see the creation of a global middle class. This global middle class will become the most powerful force in the world. Powerful politically, powerful socially, and above all, powerful economically. Its demand for the products and services you can provide is so huge that it will set off not only an economic boom, but what more and more very serious economists believe will be a sonic boom. There is a small number of us, but growing larger fast, who believes that with a little bit of luck, if we play this right, if we elect people who know how to work this, we could be on the verge of a supersonic boom. And by the way, if you look at the industries that will dominate the 21st century, energy, food, infrastructure, healthcare, education, entertainment, what country holds the world's leadership in all 6 industries? It's the United States. Wow. Look, we're all grown-ups, okay? We've all been around the block a dozen times. Everything takes longer than you want. Everything costs more. God knows we make mistakes. We're human beings. And we're the United States. We don't make little mistakes. Sweden makes little mistakes. The United States makes gigantic mistakes. And again, whether we elect Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives, human beings make mistakes when the United States does no such thing as a small mistake. So sure, we're going to make mistakes and have setbacks along the way, but holy cow. If instead of being caught in the turmoil and being troubled, depressed by all the problems we've got, which are indeed serious, you look down at the radar and see through it, and we will survive this. We've survived worse. Wow. When you see the world that lies in front of us, I cannot imagine a more interesting, more hopeful, or even a more exciting time to be alive, to be in the United States, and to be running a business like yours. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're going to take just a minute to have you fill out these feedback cards, and then Herb is going to stay here and do a question and answer session before we adjourn. So if you will, it's an obvious feedback card on your table. And there's a spot for you to put your business card in the top if you would like to do that, or just fill out the information. And then on each of the check boxes, if you're interested in meeting with a Vistage chair to learn more about Vistage and to see if it makes sense for you and your organization, just check that first box. If you're interested in having a consultation with Citywide Banks, learning more about their banking and lending capabilities, check their box. If you'd like to meet with Clifton Larson Allen, and learn more about their accounting, tax, and other consulting services, check that box. E-Employer Solutions, to learn more about how they can save you money in your human resources area, check the box. If you'd like to meet with Miner and Brown to talk about your long-term plans and for your business and how they could assist you, check the box. And if you'd like to find out more about private aviation and how that could make your life a lot more fun, check that box. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about presidential limo, please check that box, and they'd be happy to meet with you. Again, once you're completed with that, we'll have a question and answer session, and then as you leave, there's take the yellow feedback card, turn it in downstairs, and they'll give you a free parking pass to get out of the parking garage quickly. So with that, back to you.
Fine. The floor's open for questions and answers if anybody has something, except I can't see anything for the lights. So can you give me a hand here?
Yes, right over here.
Herb, thank you again for coming. Great information as usual. I have a question about the climate of American business in light of this global opportunity that's out there and our tax burden, especially with the defection of these corporate companies that are merging and moving out because it's more competitive for them. Mm-hmm. Any perspective you could share with us on that?
There's no real perspective. It's, if we keep electing people who have no idea how business works, you're going to get things like this. And it's just a shame. Now, there's nothing complicated about this. We have these incredibly high tax rates. And all it does is depress jobs. What a lot of people don't realize, and they don't teach this in the schools, is that an economy is an operating system, which means if you wanted to do something, you have to go about it the way the operating system is designed to work. There's no Republican way to make a phone call with an iPhone. There's no Democratic way. I mean, you do it the way the operating system works. Well, an economy is the same, and if we're a free market economy, there's certain things you do. And the people we elect keep doing things that are incompatible with the operating system. Sort of like slamming your phone on the table and throwing it against the wall and then wondering why it didn't make the phone call you wanted. It doesn't make any sense. So if we keep doing things that are incompatible with the operating system, you're going to screw it up, and that's what you're getting. And you just have to get people to recognize that it's an operating system. It's not that complicated. You just have to go with it, and they won't do it. And that's a political issue.
Other questions?
Yes.
Where are you?
Herb,
you certainly are.
Hold on.
We can't see anything.
On your right, Herb.
There we
Okay.
go. Okay.
I certainly are a foremost authority on the former Soviet Union. Would sure love to hear your thoughts on Russia, opportunities there, where they're headed, those types of things.
Here's the deal on Russia. In fact, I published an article on this recently. Look, as I said before, Vladimir Putin is your classic bully, and the only way you stop a bully is to punch his lights out. Okay? There is a way to do this, which to some extent the administration is doing and not getting enough credit for, and it's this. The guys behind Putin, the ones we call the oligarchs, the millionaires, the billionaires, and all that, they're his support system. He's more like a Latin American dictator than a Leonid Brezhnev or a Gorbachev running the Politburo and the whole system below him. There is no system below Putin. He's just Putin with the support of these guys. If we can put enough pressure on these guys, let them get rid of Putin. These are business people. They're more interested in a takeover of Kaiser Aluminum than of Kiev. They don't give a damn about the Ukraine or Estonia or Poland or anything else. They just want to come to the United States or Europe. They want to cut deals. They've got the yachts anchored off the Côte d'Azur. Their blonde bombshell shopaholic girlfriends are in Harrods in London. Okay? All you do is you stop that. You stop their planes from landing. You yank their credit cards. You tell them the banks won't do business with them here. Now, to some extent, the administration is doing this, and they're not getting enough credit for it. My fellow political conservatives won't give Obama credit for anything. I'm sympathetic to that, but in this case, they're actually doing the right thing. I wish they were doing it harder and faster. If you put enough pressure on these oligarchs, we'll call them as a group, they're going to look at each other one day, probably sitting on their yacht off the Côte d'Azur, and say, you know, Vladimir's a nice guy, but I can't land in London anymore. Time for him to go. Let them take care of him. Whether he goes peacefully with honors or whether he goes out of the Kremlin feet first, I have absolutely no interest and I don't care. But let those guys take care of him. Now, to some extent, as I say, the administration is moving in that direction. They're not getting enough credit for this, but I'd push it a lot harder. And I'd make sure this guy's out of there fast. Maybe I'm getting old, but my tolerance for lunatics with nuclear bombs is about 0. So we'll see what happens. But in all fairness, the administration is doing more on this than they're getting credit for. Also in Germany, Angela Merkel, who is a calm woman, slow to burn, but boy, I wouldn't want to get Angela Merkel mad at me. And Putin's made her mad. You know, Putin speaks fluent German because he was a KGB officer in Dresden. So she and him talk back and forth in, fluent German. And boy, I wouldn't mess with Angela Merkel. And she's getting fed up with him. So the pressure's on. We'll see what happens.
About the inevitability of Israel recognizing at some point the danger that Iran has a nuclear capability. Would you expand upon the capability of Israel to actually take out Iran's nuclear capability?
The Israeli Air Force can hit Iran, but not hard enough to kill the nuclear program. They can set it back. They can do a lot of damage. They can't kill it. The Iranians have dispersed their nuclear facilities all over Iran. They're 15, 20 sites. They're underground. They're under 15 feet of concrete. The Israeli Air Force isn't big enough. They haven't got enough airplanes. They haven't got the bunker busters to go through 15 feet of concrete. That's why they've asked the United States for help, and we've said no. When they have to, they'll launch. They'll do the best they can possibly do. But my information is they can hit it. They can hit it pretty hard, but they can't kill it. They just haven't got enough to do it, which is why they want some help from the United States. We'll see what happens. You know, at their point, it's survival. If you can't take away that nuclear threat, you literally cannot survive. You know, I hate to say it, we could lose one of our cities and we're still the United States. If they lose Tel Aviv, there's no Israel. So they just have no elbow room. Now, maybe we can get lucky. Maybe there'll be a revolution in Iran, solves the problem. Iran is Muslim, but not Arab. Very different, it's more modern. 70% of the Iranian population is under the age of 30. They hate the regime. They were out demonstrating in 2009. They were trying to knock it over. They were begging us for help, and we didn't help them. And I think even the people in Washington understand that was a lost opportunity. Well, you know, this is why we had a CIA. If you had the kind of spies we used to have, these guys would be throwing banana peels under the Iranian regime's feet. We could trip these guys. Could still do it. But there's no one in Washington now with the will to do that. So this is just a dicey thing, and you're up against a clock, because once they have a nuclear bomb, you can't attack. It's too late. So we'll see what happens. But buckle your seatbelts. I don't think the Israelis will allow this to happen. It's their survival. And getting wiped out by a genocidal lunatic once was enough. It's not going to happen a second time. So we'll see. Right?
Other questions?
Could you make some comments on the Central American or South American economies?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of reason to be optimistic in Central and South America. They're developing middle-class societies quickly. Some are doing better than others. Venezuela's a basket case and all that. Argentina is always the world's next economic success. They never quite make it. But there's a simple rule in business, which is find out what Walmart's doing, do it. And companies like Walmart, Ace Hardware, companies like that, are moving into Latin America. They have young populations. They're emerging rapidly from poverty. If I were running a business, I'd be looking at Latin America. It tends to get ignored. It's not as dramatic as Africa or Asia, but Latin America is definitely moving up in the future. Keep your eye on that. It's a good one. Anybody else?
Yes, I've enjoyed your facts about population, world growth, but you didn't mention much about Africa. Could you just give me an overview?
Sure. Well, as I did say, actually, 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are now in sub-Saharan Africa. That's fantastic. And this is really interesting. It's no longer accurate to say Africa, because this country's doing very well, that one isn't doing very well. You have to look at it country by country. And some of them are doing a lot better than others. And it's an interesting process here. You know, if you're 15 years old and you want to blame all your problems on mommy and daddy, fine, you're 15 years old. If you're 45 years old and you're still blaming mommy and daddy, you've got the problem. Well, you've got a generation of African leaders now who say, look, my grandfather can barely remember colonialism. So am I going to sit here angry at the British? Let's just get a high-speed internet line in here. Let's get this thing organized. Let's get moving. And they are. And there are African countries with elected leaders who are graduates of the University of Chicago, the economics department, which is impressive. And they're getting the thing moving. So the answer is Africa's doing pretty well. As I mentioned, Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut said the busiest franchises in Nigeria. Remember Rwanda, where they had the disaster? 800,000 people were macheted to death. I can never remember if the Hutus killed the Tutsis or the other way around, but it was horrible. Well, Marriott is now building a hotel in Rwanda. It's growing at about 8% a year. And the reason Marriott's putting up a hotel is people like you are going there and cutting deals. So the answer is, despite the problems they have, the Ebola virus and things, Africa is emerging from poverty at a huge rate. The number of people with disposable income is over 300 million. And the African middle class, which is kind of the next level up, will probably grow by 20 or 30 million over the next 20 years or so. So the answer is there's a lot of reason to be very optimistic about Africa.
Be one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
You've painted a relatively optimistic, rosy picture of the United States and its prospects for the future. What about the federal deficit? What about the entitlements and the debt?
Look, these are serious issues, and you'd have to be a fool not to realize that could take us down. First, I'm an optimist. We learned this from Reagan. Be an optimist. It's just a lot better to get up in the morning and be an optimist. Also, there's something in the American DNA. We don't get serious until the last possible minute. When my children were growing up, they would completely waste the weekend and then sit down to do their homework at 10:30 Sunday night. It would make my wife and me completely crazy. My son used to write his book reports on the school bus in on Monday morning. Okay? I used to do that too. There's something about us that we just don't get serious until the last possible minute. I'm not saying this is a good trait, I'm just saying that's the way it is. My guess is that we will start to get serious about the debt and the deficit and all these things the day after the last talking head on Fox Business says it is now technically too late to save the country. That's when we actually get serious and save it. Now, I'm not bragging about that. These are very serious problems, but I think we won't turn to them and get serious until it's almost too late. And that's just the way we do things. It's too bad, but that's the way we are. And if you look at the history, that's what happens, and that's why I'm an optimist. And my last word of advice to you is, there was a wonderful, wonderful book written by a man who survived the concentration camps. His name was Viktor Frankl, F-R-A-N-K-L. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's one of the great books of the 20th century. And he got interested in the question of why did some people survive the concentration camps like him and others did not? Well, to some extent, it's just luck. If they shoot you, they shoot you. If they shove you into the gas chamber, you're dead. But he thought there was something other, and some people just didn't have the biological health to survive. But he thought there was something else, and he described it, and it's become one of the most famous sentences in literature. He said, the one thing that can never be taken away is the last freedom, the freedom to choose your own attitude, the freedom to choose your own way in a set of circumstances. And it seems to me that's where this leaves us. We all agree on what the problems are. We all agree on what the opportunities are. The one thing that we choose ourselves, each one of us, is what should be our attitude toward all this. Either we can choose to be pessimistic, just wait for the end to come, or we can say, okay, it's a mess, but you know, we're human beings, we're Americans, we're enterprising, we've got ingenuity, let's just go out and make it better. That seems to me, if we take that attitude, we'll figure this out, and tomorrow will be better. And thank you again for listening to me.
Just a quick few closing comments. First of all, a copy of today's presentation will be on the coloradoceoforum.com by Monday, October the 6th, no later than Monday, October the 6th. So one thing that a lot of people do is go back to your companies, pull your management team together, sit down and watch the same presentation you saw today. So I'd invite you all to do that. And next, I'd like to thank Maureen Gagan, who's the executive director of this organization. And without her, none of this would happen, and my job would be a whole lot harder. So, and finally, just one more thank you to all of our partners whose work, efforts, financial contributions make this possible for the last 15 years. So if you would, please join me in thanking all of our partners. And then next year, we will be back right around this time of year with Brian Bolio for the 16th annual Colorado CEO Forum, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you. Bye-bye.